Welcome, weary listener. Tonight, we journey far back in time to a place of stone cloisters, candlelit corridors, and quiet chants echoing through mossy halls. You are about to step into the slow, smoke-swirled rhythm of monastic life in 14th century Ireland. But rather than joining the robed brethren in their sacred rituals or silent prayers, you'll spend your time beside a smoky hearth, standing in the soot-darkened kitchen where life was anything but serene. In this world, faith was the backbone of daily life, but food was its humbler companion. Meals were not just nourishment, but a test of patience, obedience, and endurance. In this abbey, nestled somewhere along the damp green coast of medieval Ireland, a monastic cook toiled in silence, rising before the sun, feeding dozens, stretching barley into miracles, and braving cold stone floors long. Before the first bell called the others to prayer, there were no ovens as we know them, no spice racks bursting with color, no guarantees of warmth or praise. There were just long hours, heavy pots, and the constant presence of smoke. In many ways, it was a sacred duty. In others, it was a slow and steady form of suffering. So, settle in. Let the outside world drift away. Breathe gently. We begin in the quiet heart of the abbey, where a single man begins his day not with prayer, but with the crackle of wet peat and the weight of 80 empty stomachs. Chapter 1. Feeding 80 brothers with one pot of barley. Imagine waking in darkness, the kind that clings to stone and settles deep in your bones. Before the birds have stirred, before the chapel bell tolls its first cold note, the monastic cook rises. Not from a soft bed, but from a hard straw pallet tucked away behind the kitchens, with the scent of yesterday's smoke still clinging to the rafters. There is no fire yet, only the chill of early morning pressing in like a second cloak. He moves quietly, barefoot on damp stone, guided by memory. His first task is simple, yet consuming. The fire must be lit. The peat blocks are damp from the coastal air, the flint stubborn in his hand. Sparks catch, smoke curls upward, thick and slow, finding its familiar place along the ceiling. The heat will take time, and there's barley to soak. Barley plain, coarse, and the backbone of nearly every meal served in the abbey. It is not the barley of festive tables or noble feasts. This is the barley of survival, grown in rough fields, ground by hand or by creaking watermill, boiled into porridge or thin soup. Today, like most days, it will be the center of the meal, served in a single wooden pot from which ladles will draw portions for 80 brothers, 80 men, 80 bowls, one pot. There's no recipe to follow, only rhythm. The cook knows when the water is hot enough by how it trembles, not boils. He adds the barley by feel, by weight in his palm, honed by years of guesswork. No spices. Salt, if it is available, must be rationed like treasure. And if the barley has weevils, as it often does, he will pretend not to see them. The brethren must eat, and there is no second pot. In the dark hours before prime, the cook moves like a shadow between tasks. The bread from yesterday's batch is fetched, hardening in its basket. If there's any cheese, it is unwrapped from linen speckled with age. He checks the fish barrels, not for variety, but for edibility. Preserved herring, its scent sharp and clinging, is a reluctant guest at the table. If the weather has been bad, the barrel may be nearly empty, the fish too soft or sour to serve. In those moments, he says a quiet prayer, not out of piety, but out of desperation. No one thanks the cook. No one praises his work. There is no applause in the refectory. His success is marked only by silence by full bowls and the absence of complaints. A burnt pot, however, is noticed. A watery porridge earns murmurs. A missing meal, rare though it may be, could bring the ire of the abbot himself. The cook eats last, if there is enough. More often, he eats what remains at the bottom of the pot, scraping burnt barley from the sides with a wooden spoon smoothed down by years of quiet hunger. This is not punishment. It is the way things are. In the rule of Saint Benedict, all men are equal under God. But in practice, some labor while others pray. It is a quiet kind of servitude, performed daily, with no fanfare. Yet it is critical. The monks chant in the chapel, they copy texts in the scriptorium, they heal wounds in the infirmary. But without the cook, they do none of these things. Hunger is louder than any hymn. The air thickens as the fire grows. A warm orange glow casts long shadows across the flagstone floor. It will be time soon, time to ladle out the portions, to carry them across the cloister walk, to place them on the long wooden tables where the brothers will file in silent, eyes down, hands folded. There will be no talking as they eat. Only the sound of spoons slow and steady, and the voice of one monk reading scripture aloud from a pulpit. The cook will not hear the reading. He will be scrubbing the pot, rinsing it in cold water, preparing for the next meal, which is already pressing close. There is no glory in this work, only necessity, only the smell of barley, the weight of silence, and the constant haze of smoke that settles over everything. There's a certain rhythm to monastic life. You wake, you pray, you work, you eat, and you repeat. But for the cook, that rhythm is offbeat. While others kneel in the chapel for lauds, hands clasped in quiet devotion, he's already elbow deep in labor, scrubbing the inside of the pot with cold water that bites at his fingers. There's no warm basin, no comfort in the task. Just the knowledge that once this is done, the next meal must begin. Barley alone isn't enough. Not in winter, when the days are short and the hunger longer. He knows how to stretch what little he has. Sometimes he mixes in a handful of dried nettles for color. Sometimes he crumbles a sliver of hard cheese into the pot, if the stores allow. But most days, it's just barley and water. If he's lucky, a ladle of yesterday's broth lingers at the bottom of the pot. A thin layer of flavor scraped into today's meal. Outside, the abbey seems peaceful. Morning mist hangs in the air, and the cloister garden still holds the chill of the night. But the kitchen is already stifling. Not warm, stifling. The peat smoke doesn't always rise as it should. It creeps along the ceiling beams, clings to the cook's tunic, and makes his eyes sting. He doesn't flinch. After years of this, he barely notices. A young novice enters silently, carrying a basket of carrots with the top still attached. They're crooked, freshly pulled, with dirt still clinging to the roots. He sets them down on the table and looks at the cook, waiting for a nod, a gesture, anything. Words aren't allowed during kitchen hours unless absolutely necessary. The cook gives him a glance and a small nod. It's enough. The boy begins peeling. There's no time to waste. By midday, the refectory will be full again. 2 meals a day, one at noon, one in the early evening. Always the same rush. Always the same pot. Sometimes the cook imagines what it must be like to sit at one of those long wooden tables, hands washed bowl in front of you with no worry except whether you'll get the end of the loaf or a slice from the middle. He wonders what it's like to eat without knowing how the food got there, to have someone else bear the burden of the fire and the smoke. He remembers one winter years ago when a storm flooded the grain stores. The water came up through the floor, fast and without warning. Half the barley was ruined. The rest had to be dried slowly near the hearth, batch by batch. For weeks, the meals were thin and bitter, and the abbot ordered extra prayers for divine favor. No one prayed for the cook, though. He simply worked harder, stayed up later, burned his hands, stirring the pot too close to the fire. And yet, for all of this, he stays, not for recognition, not for reward, but because someone has to. The brothers rely on him, even if they never say it. The abbey runs on more than faith. It runs on food, on fuel, on hands that keep the fires burning. As the second meal of the day approaches, he begins again. Barley into the pot, water over the barley. The familiar stir of the wooden spoon, the quiet hiss of the fire finding its strength. Behind him, the novice slices yesterday's bread into thick, uneven pieces. The crusts are rough, the centers are dry, but they'll do. There is something oddly sacred in the repetition, something honest in the effort. He may never kneel in the choir stalls or hold a gilded manuscript, but his offering is no less holy. He feeds the faithful. He fuels the prayers. And when night falls and the abbey sinks into silence once again, he'll return to his little corner behind the kitchen, arms sore, clothes stiff with smoke. He'll lie on the straw mattress, eyes fixed on the timber-bird ceiling, and before sleep finds him, he'll think not of saints or salvation, but of whether the barley will hold out through the week, and if the fish barrel will smell worse tomorrow. That is the rhythm of his life, not measured by hymns or bells, but by hunger and pots and quiet labor in the service of others. Chapter 2, Fasting and Fevers. Fasting was not just an occasional religious practice in the abbey. It was a rhythm, an ever-present rule written into the bones of the calendar. On some days, the monks would eat nothing until evening. And depending on the rule of the house or the interpretation of scripture that day, even fish might be restricted. What remained? Barley, again, oats, dried peas. A few carrots if they hadn't gone soft. Cabbage endlessly boiled into pale mush. The result was a kind of milky paste, served warm in wooden bowls, without seasoning, without pride. But it sustained. It kept the weakest alive through Lent, gave the feverish something to swallow between chills. The monks believed illness was a test of faith, a scourging of the body to purify the soul. The cook saw it differently. He saw pale skin and shaking hands, hollow cheeks and lips that barely moved. He did not preach. Meals were not meant to please. They were meant to sustain the spirit while denying the flesh. He refused to break the rules, refused to accept even the blandest of broths. The cook tried to speak to him once in the corridor after Vespers. It was simple even more than usual. Just cabbage softened in water with a pinch of ground mustard seed if he could manage it. No salt, no oil. The brothers would sit again in silence, listening to a reading from the Book of Job, while the cook leaned against the doorframe, watching with tired eyes as they spooned the fast into their mouths. He asked gently whether the brother might consider something warm for the sake of his strength. He would lie down, the scent of smoke still in his hair, and sleep would come not as rest, but as pause, because tomorrow it would begin again. The fasting, the fire, the quiet work of keeping others alive one bowl at a time. The old monk simply smiled, faint and weary, and said, "I will not let hunger steal my soul." That night, the cook left a bowl of broth outside his door anyway. It was still there in the morning, cold and untouched, but something in the gesture had settled the cook's heart. But for the cook, who saw more of the flesh than any cloistered brother ever would, the line between the two was not so clear. Not the great works of copied scripture, not the rare visitors from Rome, but the daily choices made over barley and broth, over rules and mercy, and always, always the fast returned. Like the tide, like the bell. He knew which monk took too long to chew, which one scraped his bowl for every last grain, which one had not come to the table in 3 days. He saw the signs of decline long before the infirmarian wrote that silent black mark. He stirred, and he served. These were the materials he had to work with, and still the expectation remained. Fill the bellies without breaking the rules. Within days, a quarter of the monks were laid up in the infirmary, wheezing through the night. The cook slept little that week, but to the monastic cook, it was more often a daily negotiation between suffering and obedience. There were rules, and then there were bodies. And when those two realities collided, it was his job to stand in the middle, apron stained, sleeves rolled, watching the line between piety and starvation blur. The demands on the kitchen doubled, then tripled, even though fewer mouths came to the refectory. He made pot after pot of the same pale food, his hands red from washing, his eyes dry from smoke. The brothers who remained well took on some of his duties, hauling water, fetching herbs, but no one else dared oversee the food. That was his task. That was his burden. It was less cooking than it was theological compliance measured in spoons. On others, they would eat less than nothing, consuming food so sparse, so joyless, that it was hard to even call it a meal. The rule did not allow it, and he had long since lost the habit. Instead, his protest was silent, carved into his hands, which cracked in the cold and stiffened in the heat. His voice, if it had one, lived in the food. In the way he stirred a little longer for the sick. In the way he tucked the better pieces of bread beneath the rough crusts when laying out the platters. In the way he left a single spoonful extra at the bottom of the bowl in the infirmary, hoping that someone, even half-conscious, might find comfort in the effort. In better seasons, the trees bore small, sour fruit. But for much of the year, they stood bare and brittle, their bark peeling like paper. Here, the cook often brought trays of thin gruel and crustless bread, offerings for the sick whose bodies could barely endure the fasting days. There was a silent arrangement between the cook and the infirmarian, an old brother with stooped shoulders and kind hands. When a monk could no longer keep his food down or had not eaten for days, the infirmarian would send a folded scrap of parchment, marked with a small black line. Nothing more. No words. Just a line. The cook would know what it meant. Ember days, rogation days, Lent, Advent, and countless saints' days, nearly half the year passed in some form of dietary restraint. And through it all, the monastic cook was expected to maintain a fragile balance between obedience and sustenance. He was not free to simply serve less food. That would be seen as laziness. No, he had to create meals that were technically compliant, but still edible, even comforting in their austerity. Imagine the challenge of making broth without bones, soup without fat, flavor without sin. On fasting days, oil was forbidden, dairy was forbidden, eggs were forbidden. The abbey's infirmary sat at the far end of the cloister garden, tucked beneath a sagging roof and shaded by a row of crooked apple trees. He would boil barley longer, mash peas to a pulp, strain broth through linen to catch the floating husks. One spring, a coughing sickness swept through the abbey. It arrived quietly in the lungs of a visiting pilgrim and spread faster than any fire. It is easy, from the comfort of a modern kitchen, to imagine medieval fasting as quaint, or as a kind of spiritual retreat, and yet he never complained. Not aloud, at least. Monastic life demanded detachment. There was one brother, old even when the cook was young, who fasted with such intensity that he would collapse after prayer. These moments made up the quiet story of the abbey. Now, as the day faded into the pale stillness of evening, the cook prepared the final meal. And as night fell, as the last bowl was scraped and the pot left to soak in cold ashes, he would return once more to the little room behind the kitchen. In the cloistered world of the abbey, time was marked not by seasons or years, but by feast and fast, work and rest, and the slow, swinging rhythm of bells that divided the day into holy intervals. But beneath that divine pattern lay a second rhythm, more earthly, more relentless. It was the rhythm of need. It was measured in coughs behind the refectory door, in the sunken eyes of the infirm, in the silent groans of a brother who could no longer rise for prayer. And always the cook felt it before the others noticed. The signs of illness were small at first, less food taken from the bowl. Rows of straw mats lined the floor, each with a pale figure beneath it. They had cracked from the cold, the skin split near his knuckles, raw from scrubbing pots in icy water. He wrapped them in strips of linen and leaned back against the wall, eyes closing. But sleep was slow to come. The thought of the infirmary, of the coughing, the weak limbs, the shivering forms under thin blankets, it stayed with him. He moved carefully, placing the bowl beside his sleeping brother whose skin glistened with fever. No words were exchanged. They never were. Not feasts, not indulgences, just food that could heal. He boiled the same ingredients, but longer. Lashed them smoother, folded in a few drops of oil when no one was looking. He lined the bowls with bits of dry sage to add aroma. He made it look humble, unremarkable. The light was out, the bowls were empty. The fast for now was over. But the monks who ate those meals began to recover, slowly. Their eyes brightened, their hands steadied. They whispered quiet blessings when they passed the kitchen, nodding at him in that discreet way monks do when they aren't supposed to notice one another. The abbot, old and careful, listened in silence. Then he looked down at his folded hands and nodded once. "Feed them," he said softly. It tested not just the one who abstained, but the one who provided. The cook bore the full weight of that contradiction. He had to withhold and yet nourish, deny and yet protect. He walked allowing no one else in the abbey seemed to see, and he walked it alone. But make it look like fasting. That was all. It was enough. But one or two of the eyes that followed him seemed to soften for a moment, as if recognizing not just a man, but a kindness, a slow pace across the cloister. A longer pause after the midday meal, head bowed a little lower. He had grown accustomed to these clues. Over time, he learned to tell the difference between fatigue and fever. The frost glittered on the herbs, the frozen earth crunching beneath his feet. He would breathe in the silence, thick and still, and let it settle over him. There was no fire left in the kitchen, no prayers left in the chapel. But there was peace in that moment. A quiet peace, earned not through devotion, but through care. It had been midsummer, but he had shaken like it was the depth of winter. Others, especially the younger ones, accepted it more grudgingly, their hunger written plainly across their faces. The ground refused to thaw, and the stored vegetables began to rot from the inside out. Carrots turned soft, onions split open. The cabbage froze in the barrels and collapsed into mush. The cook did what he could. He made stews so thin they barely colored the water. He crushed stale bread and soaked it in boiled nettle, hoping it would stretch further. Still, the brothers grew weaker. One by one, they staggered into the infirmary, pale and hollow. But none dared defy the rule. During Lent, meals were reduced to near nothing. The cook was told to serve a single portion each evening, barely enough to nourish. For the healthy, it was difficult. For the sick, it was dangerous. He had been too weak to sit upright, too tired to pray. It was the old cook, then, a stern man with a bent back, who had brought him broth. No words, just broth, left by his side with a torn piece of bread. It had saved him in more ways than one. That memory returned now, not as sentiment, but as a quiet responsibility. Between the self-denial of a devout monk and the silent suffering of one whose body was breaking down, it was not a note or a spoken word. It was a wooden bowl placed outside his door, with a sprig of dried thyme tucked beneath it. That was the signal now. The old infirmarian had gone to God the year before, and his replacement, a younger, stricter man, preferred signs over speech. The time meant the fever had returned. When he could, he intervened, quietly, indirectly, a thicker broth for Brother Angus, an extra slice of softened bread for Brother Colin. Not all of them were allowed in the kitchen, but he used what he had. He crushed them gently and stirred them into a barley gruel, thickened with mashed lentils and cooled slightly to avoid burning the throat. Then he wrapped the bowl in cloth and carried it to the infirmary himself, the steam curling around his face as he stepped into the bitter wind. None of it was officially allowed, but then again no one spoke against it either. The abbey, for all its rules, understood that survival required small mercies. One winter evening, after a snowstorm that had buried the garden under a thick, icy crust, the cook received a message from the infirmary. He boiled water at once, using the last of the stored herbs he'd hidden behind the root vegetables: wild sage, elderflower, willow bark. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp straw and old sweat. Later that night, back in the kitchen, he sat by the dying fire, rubbing his hands slowly. He remembered being sick once, years ago, before he had taken full charge of the kitchen. Some of the monks believed that fasting was a form of protection, a shield against the temptations of the body. One year, Lent coincided with a terrible frost. He begged the abbot for permission to make thicker meals. So the cook returned to the kitchen and went to work. Fasting, he had come to realize, was a strange form of faith. On the coldest nights, after the last spoon had been scraped, he would step outside into the garden. And as he turned back toward the door, his hands tucked beneath his cloak, he would glance once at the darkened infirmary window. Chapter 3. Of Rats and Relics. The kitchen was never quiet. Even in the dead of night, when the last embers hissed in their bed of ash and the corridor torches had long burned out, there was always something stirring. A soft scrape in the pantry, a hushed scurry across the floorboards. The cook knew those sounds better than he knew the chants echoing from the chapel. He didn't flinch when he heard them. He didn't rise from his mat. He just listened, eyes open, staring into the dark. The rats were back. It was a war he never won. They came from the walls, from the garden, from the drains when it rained. They chewed through the barley sacks, tore into the bread cloths, left droppings behind the barrels. And no matter how many traps he set, how many corners he swept, they always returned. Clever things, persistent, drawn by the same smells that brought the brethren to table. Even the faintest trace of grain, a drop of spilled ale, was enough to summon them in droves. He had once sealed the grain storeroom with planks and hammered the edges shut with thick nails. It bought him 3 days of peace. Then he found a hole beneath the back corner, chewed straight through the stone, it seemed. He cursed under his breath, though never aloud. He couldn't afford to shout. The walls echoed. The monks might hear. And there was nothing sacred in the sound of rage. The abbey officially discouraged the killing of animals, even pests. All creatures, they said, had their place in God's design. But the cook knew that place should not be in his pantry. So he laid the traps anyway. Small wooden boards with rusted hinges, baited with crumbs or bits of old lard. And each morning, he would check them with a grim patience. Sometimes they were sprung. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they disappeared entirely, dragged into unseen spaces. The rats were that bold. Yet alongside the rats came other visitors, less unwelcome, but no less unsettling. Relics. The abbey possessed several. Bones of long-dead saints. Shards of wood said to be from the true cross. A stained piece of cloth that had once touched the robe of St. Columba. These were brought out during feast days or special prayers, carried reverently through the cloisters, kissed by the devout, wept over by pilgrims. But to the cook, they were a kind of mystery he didn't quite know how to hold. One relic in particular made regular visits to the kitchen, a sliver of bone housed in a glass and silver case, said to belong to St. Bryson, an early Irish healer. It was brought to the kitchen once each season and placed on the high shelf above the hearth. A ritual, the abbot explained, to bless the food and the hands that prepared it. The cook never argued. He bowed his head when it arrived, wiped the shelf clean before the relic was placed. But part of him watched it with unease. The case glinted in the firelight. The bone inside was brown and fragile, no bigger than a thumb, resting on a faded scrap of velvet. It stayed for 3 days each visit, then was returned to the sacristy. During that time, the monks ate with quiet reverence. Some whispered that meals tasted better when the relic was present, that the barley was softer, the broth warmer. The cook knew better. He never changed the recipe, but he let them believe. It was easier than arguing with faith. Once, during one of these visits, a rat appeared bold as brass, scuttling across the floor during supper. It darted past the benches and vanished into the shadows. The monk reading scripture paused just for a heartbeat, then continued as though nothing had happened. No one spoke of it. After the meal, the cook returned to the kitchen and found a trail of barley leading from the storeroom to the hearth. He cleaned it up in silence, the relic watching from above, unblinking. Superstition ran deep in the abbey. Some monks believed the rats were drawn by sin, that they were a punishment or a warning. Others claimed that certain relics kept them away. One even swore he saw a rat kneel before a bone fragment of St. Finbar, though no one took him seriously after that. The cook didn't believe in rat miracles. He believed in sealing barrels tight and sleeping with a broom near the door. Still, the relics fascinated him, not for their holiness, but for what they meant to others. He saw the way the brothers gazed at them, the way pilgrims wept just to touch the casing. There was power in that, even if he didn't understand it. He began to wonder what would happen if he placed one near the pantry. Would the rats avoid it? Would the food be spared? He never dared try. The relics were too sacred, too watched. But the thought lingered. There were older stories too. Whispers of relics that had cursed entire kitchens. Of a chalice once buried beneath a hearth, only to poison every meal cooked above it. Of a reliquary that wept blood in the presence of spoiled meat. Legends, surely. But when the wind howled through the walls and the rats scratched behind the shelves, those stories crept closer to belief. Late one night, after a long fast, the cook sat by the fire and stared up at the shelf. The relic had been placed earlier that day, and the kitchen was unusually still. No scuttling. No distant chewing. just the soft crackle of burning peat. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe, not in the bone itself, perhaps, but in what it represented: hope, protection, a line between chaos and order. He closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of warm barley and smoke. If nothing else, the relic offered quiet. And that, in the world of the monastic kitchen, was a blessing worth more than silver. The pantry had once been a place of comfort, a cool, dry chamber tucked behind the kitchen wall, where the smell of stored grain and hanging herbs created a kind of earthy perfume. There were stone shelves for root vegetables, barrels for dried peas, sacks of barley stacked carefully against the corners. On feast days, when meat was allowed, salted joints of pork or lamb hung from the wooden beams, swinging gently in the damp air. But over the years, the pantry had become a battleground, not just against rats, but against rot, mildew, and the slow decay that crept in no matter how vigilant the cook remained. A stone smoothed by the sea, placed by a novice with trembling hands. A small iron spoon, said to have belonged to a 6th-century brother, who cooked during the founding of the abbey. It had been kept in a carved wooden case, passed down through the generations until one day it simply vanished. Some said it had been stolen by a jealous lay brother. The question was unexpected, offered not as a challenge but as a quiet curiosity. The cook had paused, hands still damp from washing, and thought for a moment. He checked the corners, pressed his hand to the sacks, sniffed the air. All was quiet, for now. And above the hearth, the relic watched in silence. No miracles. Just a man, a fire, and a storeroom full of hope. Then he replied, "I believe in what they mean to those who see them." The abbot had smiled faintly and said no more. Others claimed it was hidden during the time of Viking raids and never recovered. The cook often wondered about that spoon, what it had seen. Sometimes it was the belief that the food would stretch just enough, that the rats would wait one more night before chewing through the barley sack, that the fire would light again in the morning. The relics stood as reminders of this quiet faith, not in divine intervention, but in endurance. Whether its original owner had felt the same weight he did now of feeding many with little, of keeping hunger at bay with bare hands. A folded strip of cloth that smelled faintly of lavender. Did he also curse the damp, chase rats from the barrels, whisper apologies to the bread when it grew too hard to slice? Did he place herbs under relics and hope for a winter that wasn't cruel? There was no record of him in the abbey's texts. Just the spoon gone now. And yet his work lived on, unspoken, in every bowl of barley served. Even the older monks, those who spoke sternly of discipline and rule, would glance just a little longer at the relic before they passed it. The cook observed these moments without comment, but he understood them. Each morning, before the fire was lit, he would step into the pantry with a small oil lamp and inspect the stores. His hands moved carefully across each sack, checking for holes, damp patches, or the telltale softness that meant mold had taken hold. A portion of the outer wall gave way, letting in water from the garden. He hung dried lavender and mint near the grain to mask the scent from rats. He scattered ash near the corners to mark tiny footprints. He stuffed linen into cracks in the stone where the smallest of vermin might enter. These were his charms, not blessed by scripture, but earned by repetition. And sometimes when the relic shelf held nothing but dust and echoes, it was these efforts that gave him comfort. The rain had soaked into the lowest sacks before anyone noticed. By the time the cook discovered it, the smell was already rising, a sour, pungent rot that clung to the back of the throat. He spent 3 days clearing it out, throwing away what couldn't be saved, scrubbing the stones with vinegar and ash. His hands bled from the work. And when he was finished, the pantry stood nearly empty. If a sack was compromised, it had to be emptied, salvaged if possible, burned if not. The cook, meanwhile, made soup from old bread and thinned it with cabbage water. No one thanked him. No one blamed him, but he felt the strain all the same. The pantry had failed, and to him that felt personal. Nothing spoiled could be served. That was a hard rule. They were reassurance. A way to hold on to something when all else seemed to fall apart. One evening, As the storm continued outside and the barrels rattled from the wind, the cook retrieved a dried sprig of rosemary from behind a jar of pickled beets. He tied it into a small loop and placed it at the base of the relic shelf, just beneath the bone of St. Bryson. He said nothing. He made no sign of the cross. But it was a gesture, a quiet plea for preservation, for peace. And when the supplies were low, as they often were, each sack lost felt like a blow to the chest. One year, after a particularly wet summer, the pantry suffered a collapse. The abbot declared a fast in response, a holy sign, he called it. The brothers prayed for guidance. In moments like these, the relics became more than ritual. He wasn't the only one. Over time, he began to notice other small offerings tucked near the relics when they were brought out. There was one relic that had been lost for years. Sometimes, during long nights when the fire crackled low and the brothers slept soundly in their cells, he imagined the old cook standing where he stood now. The cook had his own methods of protection. Beyond the relics and rituals, there were practical tools. In one rare moment of conversation, the abbot once asked him whether he believed in the relics. In the end, belief was not always a matter of miracles or saints. As another season turned and the damp settled deeper into the walls, the cook returned once more to the pantry. Chapter 4. Smoke, Sweat, and Silence. There were few sounds in the monastic kitchen more constant than the soft hiss of wet peat catching fire. It was a quiet sound, easy to miss, but the cook had learned to hear it even in his sleep. When the bell rang for matins in the earliest hours, it wasn't a call to prayer that woke him, but the pressure of knowing the fire needed coaxing again, that without it nothing else could begin. The fire, like hunger, did not wait for prayer. The kitchen was not spacious. It was low-ceilinged and narrow, with smoke-darkened stones rising around a single blackened hearth. Iron hooks hung from wooden beams, most of them empty. A single window, no wider than the cook's arm, let in light during the day and a draft during the night. The smell of smoke was permanent, not just in the room, but in the cook's hair, his skin, even his hands. It followed him to the refectory, clung to his cloak during chapel prayers, soaked into his bedding no matter how often he scrubbed it. There was no escaping the scent. It was a second skin. He worked in silence. That was the rule. Benedict had written it centuries earlier. Let speech be rare and measured. In the kitchen, only the abbot could grant exceptions, and he seldom did. The cook and his few assistants, novices, usually your elderly brothers no longer suited for field labor, relied on hand gestures. A wave meant more water. A point toward the shelf signaled for bread. A twist of the hand meant stir faster. They learned quickly or not at all. Words belonged to the sacred spaces. In the kitchen, everything was shown, not spoken. The silence was not peaceful. It was weighty, thick as steam. It turned small mistakes into calamities. When a pot tipped or a ladle clattered to the floor, the sound rang out like a bell, sharp and shameful. The cook never raised his voice. He didn't have to. A narrowed glance, a slight pause in movement, was enough to correct a novice. In time, they learned. And if they didn't, they were reassigned to garden work, where weeds forgave more than boiling pots did. There was one novice, years ago, who struggled with the silence. A bright-eyed boy from the West Coast, sent to the abbey by a family too poor to feed him. He fumbled constantly, dropping bowls, bumping into tables, forgetting signals. One day, he spoke just one word, muttered in frustration. The sound cut through the kitchen like a knife. The cook stopped stirring, slowly lowered the ladle, and turned to face him. No punishment followed. The boy was simply led out by another brother. Silent as ever, he never returned to the kitchen. Yet for all its rules and rituals, there was a strange kind of intimacy in the silence. A bond forged not through conversation, but through shared tasks. The cook knew the way each helper moved, the shuffle of Brother Finton's feet, the careful precision of old Brother Cormac as he diced roots with shaking hands. He could sense when something was off by the way a pot was stirred, or how long someone lingered by the barrel of oats. They became part of one another's rhythms, communicating in glances and gestures. There was no need for speech when everything was already understood. The hardest part of the day was midday. The refectory filled with brothers in their worn robes, filing in 2 by 2, eyes down, mouths closed. A single monk stood at the pulpit, reading scripture in a slow, steady voice. The rest ate in silence, each movement deliberate. No chewing sounds, no scraping of bowls. Just the voice, the slow rhythm of spoons, and the occasional clink of wood on stone. The cook did not eat with them. He stood at the back of the room, near the door, ready to carry in second helpings or replace empty jugs of water. No one looked at him, but he felt their presence all the same. It was during these meals that he most felt the strain of his role. He watched as the monks ate food he had labored over since before dawn food, made with bare hands, with tools that burned or splintered or bruised. They accepted it without comment, without thanks. And that, too, was the rule. Gratitude was to be directed heavenward, not toward the cook. Still, he couldn't help but scan their faces, looking for signs. Did Brother Coleman wince at the soup? Did Brother Mail rub his stomach after eating? These were his only feedback. Subtle cues in a room too still for comfort. After the meal, he returned to the kitchen. The pots were scrubbed in silence. The breadboards wiped clean. The leftovers, if there were any, went to the pig troughs behind the garden wall. There was no refrigeration, no waste allowed. Everything was used or fed to something that would later be used. Even the ashes from the hearth were collected and mixed into soap. The cycle was endless, like the turning of the liturgical calendar, each day indistinguishable from the last, and always the smoke. It filled the kitchen with a haze that stung the eyes and coated every surface. Some days it rose neatly through the flue. Other days, the wind changed direction and sent it curling back into the room. On those days, the cook wrapped his head in damp cloth and kept working. There was no time to wait for better air. The barley still needed boiling. The roots still needed chopping. The brothers would be hungry no matter the wind. There were moments, brief and fragile, when the silence felt almost sacred. Early mornings, before anyone else entered, when the fire had just caught and the first light trickled through the small window. In that quiet, the cook felt something close to peace. He moved slowly, deliberately, each motion part of a larger rhythm. Stirring, measuring, tasting. The world outside did not exist. Only the breath of the fire and the sound of water starting to boil. But such moments never lasted. A footstep would echo in the corridor. A door would creak open. The novice would appear with a basket of onions, and the day would begin in earnest. The silence would shift from sacred to strained. And the cook would return to his post, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp, ladle in hand, ready once more to feed the faithful without a word. When the rule of St. Benedict demanded silence, it did so not out of cruelty, but out of conviction that the soul needed stillness to hear the voice of God. In the chapel, that stillness took the shape of chant. In the scriptorium, it hummed beneath the scrape of quills. But in the kitchen, the silence had a different texture, thicker, grittier, shaped by heat and motion. The cook never questioned the rule, but he had learned to feel its weight in a way that few others did. It was one thing to be silent in prayer, kneeling before an altar, the scent of incense rising. It was another to hold your tongue while your hand bled from a slipped blade, or to keep your expression calm while the smoke made your eyes burn. There were no indulgences for the cook, no moments of verbal release. His penance was carried in the body, not the voice. In the heart of summer, the kitchen became nearly unbearable. The peat fire burned day and night, and the single window, designed to hold in warmth during the cold months, did little to help. The walls radiated heat. The air grew thick, not just with smoke, but with the sense of onions, boiling grains, and sweat-soaked linen. Every movement felt heavier. The cook tied damp cloth around his forehead to catch the moisture that ran down into his eyes. His robes clung to him like wet parchment. But he never stepped away. The fire had to stay lit. The bread needed turning. The brothers still needed to eat. Some days he wondered if anyone else truly understood what the kitchen took from him. The rest of the abbey flowed in time with prayer, with the gentle cadence of bells. They sat in the shade of the cloister walk. They tended to herbs in the morning mist. They read aloud from Latin texts beneath open windows. But in the kitchen, there was only fire and stone, no wind, no birdsong. Only the occasional drip of condensation from the ceiling beam onto the top of a clay pot. The cook lived in a world apart, where every breath was heavier, every moment more exacting. And he bore it quietly, not because he lacked words, but because there was no place for them. There was a discipline to the silence, a kind of order that eventually reshaped the mind. Over time, the cook stopped thinking in words altogether. Instructions became gestures in his imagination. Memories became movements. His dreams, when they came, were filled with sounds that weren't speech. The dull knock of a ladle against a bowl, the rasp of a knife. Against wood, the creak of the door that led to the pantry. Even his prayers, once spoken softly at dawn, faded into internal murmurings, half-thoughts, more rhythm than meaning. And still the work continued. Once, during a rare inspection, the bishop visited the abbey. He walked the cloisters with the abbot, nodding as he was shown the scriptorium, the library, the sacristy. When he entered the kitchen, he paused. The cook bowed his head and waited. The bishop took one step inside, frowned at the darkened ceiling, and asked, "Does the smoke not make it impossible to work?" The abbot hesitated, clearly unsure whether to respond honestly. But the cook, surprising even himself, answered, "Only at first, your grace." The bishop stared at him, as if weighing the words, then nodded once and turned away. That was the last time the cook spoke for nearly 2 years. It was not a vow of silence. It was simply the way of things. He didn't need words to instruct the novices. He didn't need conversation to prepare the broth or to knead the bread. Communication became a choreography, each movement layered with meaning. A raised eyebrow was enough to correct a mistake. A finger to the lip meant stir slower. A gentle tap on the barrel meant oats, not barley. And slowly, without anyone realizing, the cook became a language unto himself understood only by those who had stood beside him in the heat, who had seen how his silence carried more than words ever could. There were days when he missed speaking. Not the noise of it, but the shape of language in the mouth. The way words curled and uncurled, the comfort of a voice filling the empty space. But those moments passed. The longer he worked, the more he came to see speech as something too sharp, too quick for the life he lived. The kitchen required patience, not cleverness. Endurance, not eloquence. And in the hush of smoke and sweat, he found something close to truth. At times, a new brother would arrive young, fresh from a coastal village or the son of a local noble, unsure of where he fit in a monastery. Some were assigned to the library, some to the vineyard, but a few were sent to the kitchen. They arrived full of energy, eager to serve, unsure why no one spoke. The cook never explained. He simply showed them. And slowly, as they burned their fingers on the kettle or cut themselves on the root knife, they learned that silence was not absence. It was attention. It was respect. And in time, they stopped trying to talk. One such novice, Brother Dare, had once been a fisherman's son. His hands were quick, his eyes sharper than most. He learned the signals faster than anyone the cook had ever seen. After only a week, he could anticipate each motion. He'd peeled turnips with smooth precision, watched the fire without blinking, cleaned the cauldrons until they shone like polished stone. The cook never praised him. That wasn't his way. But he began to rely on the boy, to trust him with more. Until one day, during the feast of St. Charon, the novice stirred the pot of honeyed oats and looked up, mouthing a single word. "Thank you." No sound came from his lips, just the motion. And the cook, surprised by how deeply it touched him, nodded once and turned back to the bread. In that moment, he realized something profound, that even silence, gratitude could pass between them. That no chant, no litany, no sermon could carry the weight of that quiet gesture. The kitchen had taught him that. And though he would return again to the fire, to the pot, to the shadows and the smoke, he would carry that moment like a blessing. When the day ended and the novices had gone, the cook sat on his stool near the hearth, rubbing ash from his hands. The silence pressed close again, not heavy, but familiar. Like a cloak, like breath, and he understood as he stared into the fading orange glow of the fire that this silence was not a punishment, it was a presence. It was the voice beneath all others. And in that presence he found not loneliness, but peace. Chapter 5. Fish every Friday, and most. Other days, there were weeks when the cook barely saw a loaf of fresh bread or a sack of oats, but he always saw fish. Always. In barrels packed with coarse salt, lined in the bottom of baskets hauled in from nearby rivers. Hanging by their gills under the kitchen eaves, the fish never stopped arriving. Herring, mostly, occasionally trout. On rare days, eel or lamprey, slick and dark as oil, but herring was the backbone. It had to be. Others were wrapped in cloth and laid near the back wall, away from the fire, where the temperature stayed cool. He had learned to be careful. Insects loved fish as much as the monks did. And once early in his career, he'd made the mistake of leaving a bucket uncovered. Serve it alongside bread that had been lightly toasted on the hearth. The monks who lived by the coast and sent their catch to the abbey would send word by foot, a short note sealed with wax, apologizing for the storm. In those times, the cook was forced to stretch what was already in the barrels, slicing portions thinner, boiling with more water, adding barley to thicken the stew. No one protested. They simply bowed their heads and chewed longer, but the strain showed. He thought of the sea even though he rarely saw it. He imagined the fishermen out in the dark, casting lines into icy waters. He imagined the cold splash of the catch, the creak of the boat, the quiet prayer offered as the net was pulled in. And in that imagining, he felt a kind of kinship, not with saints or symbols, but with those who labored quietly, day after day, offering something to be shared. One winter, after 3 weeks of storm and salted fish, several brothers fell ill from the sameness of it. The infirmarian blamed the damp. The cook blamed the fish. Once, when the abbey hosted visiting monks from another priory, the abbot requested a special preparation. A layered dish of fish inside were 3 small trout, caught by hand from the abbey's stream. It appeared in scripture and carvings above the chapel door and the parables recited during meals. The monks saw it as sacred, a gift of abstinence, a link to Christ and his disciples. But to the cook, it was something more pragmatic, a task to manage and a source of worry, a thing that spoiled too easily and lingered too long. He understood its meaning, but he also knew its weight, the labor it demanded, the mess it left behind. Still silver, still cool. The cook prepared them with mint and a pinch of ground mustard seed, then served them only to the sick, hoping the freshness might bring some relief. One of the older monks, whose appetite had vanished weeks earlier, smiled faintly as he tasted it and said, barely audible, like I remember, that was enough. And barley, wrapped in cabbage leaves and boiled in seasoned water. The cook did as asked, though the extra steps meant rising 2 hours earlier. The visiting monks praised the meal in silence, as was customary. But one of them left a folded parchment near the kitchen door with a small charcoal sketch of the meal and the word grace written beneath it. The cook kept that note hidden in the sleeve of his robe for several years, a silent reward for his silent labor. By morning, the meat was crawling. Since then, he kept everything sealed, bound in twine, covered with damp linen. Because on Fridays, the monks didn't eat meat, boil too long, and the meat turned to pulp. Not long enough, and the bones splintered in the broth. The novices, when assigned to assist, always struggled. They stirred too fast or too slow. They forgot the timing. One young helper had once added vinegar to the fish pot, thinking it would mask the scent. The result was so sharp it made the brothers at the refectory choke in silence. The cook had said nothing. He simply handed the boy a rag and pointed to the pot. It was a long night, and neither did they on Wednesdays or during Lent or Advent or on the feast days of saints. The oily sheen of lamprey, which most brothers disliked but ate without complaint. He could tell, just by scent, how long a piece had been stored. By touch, how long it needed to cook. There was no need for a recipe. The fish spoke its own language, one the cook had learned fluently, if reluctantly, which meant nearly half the days of the year were fish days. And sometimes, depending on the abbot's interpretation of the rule, more than that. The cook had long since stopped thinking of fish as a special meal. For him, it was routine, though never easy. Fresh fish was a luxury, one he could rarely afford. More often, the fish came to him stiff with salt, their eyes cloudy, their skins hard. They had to be soaked in cold water for hours just to make them edible, then boiled gently, or if the kitchen had enough oil, and it rarely did fry it on a flat stone, the smell lingered long after the meal. It crept into the pantry, clung to the ceiling beams, settled into the cloth of his robe. Even the brothers carried it on their breath, the quiet scent of devotion mixed with brine. There was a rhythm to fish days, though not a forgiving one. The barrels arrived early, hauled in by lay brothers or fishermen who stood in the courtyard with red faces and wind-chapped hands. They carried the baskets into the kitchen, dropped them heavily onto the floor, and left without ceremony. The cook would then lift the lids and inspect the contents, sorting through stiff cales and crumbling scales, looking for signs of spoilage. Some barrels had been sealed for weeks, some for months. The worst had leaked salt water all over the floor, leaving a puddle that soaked into his boots before he could mop it up with straw. He stored what he could. Some of the fish went directly into large clay bowls to be soaked. Cooking fish was a lesson in patience. He knew every texture of fish now, the delicate flake of well-boiled trout, the rubbery pull of herring soaked too long. On feast days, he was expected to prepare the fish with greater care. Add herbs, if available. Fish days came with their own peculiar challenges. Sometimes the sea was too rough for fishing. And yet, there were moments of beauty. Once, in early spring, a brother brought him a small wicker basket lined with fresh moss. Fish was not just a food. It was a symbol. Still, when he sat near the fire after the last pot was cleaned, and the scent of smoke had nearly masked the scent of fish, he sometimes let himself reflect. One of the unspoken burdens of monastic cooking was that meals were rarely seen as your own. The cook prepared, the brothers consumed, and the food vanished without thanks, without remark. He strained it twice through muslin, then thickened it with mashed root vegetables and barley. It wasn't a meal, not really. But it smelled rich. He seasoned it with mustard seed and sage, then served it with the last crusts of bread, soaked in the broth to hide their staleness. On feast days that broke along fast, there was almost a tension in the air. The brothers expected something more, though they would never say it. The cook anticipated this too. He would search the pantry for dried herbs, roast small onions in the hearth's outer flames to bring sweetness. Sometimes even wrap the fish in cabbage leaves if they were tender enough. These little gestures softened the monotony. They were his sermons offered not in speech, but in smell and texture. The brothers disliked it too, though no one said so aloud. It arrived in batches during late summer, when the river ran high. He tried to disguise it with bitter herbs or grind it into paste with leeks, but it always announced itself. He took no joy in preparing it, yet he did, because it was what the abbey had. And that was his way. Not to complain, not to wish. Just to work with what was given. No one spoke during the meal, but no one left food behind either. In early autumn, the salmon ran upriver. It was a brief window, sometimes only a week. But when it happened, the kitchen filled with color. Pink flesh, firm and bright. The cook handled the salmon differently, with care, reverence. He smoked it gently over peat and served it cold, sliced thin, laid over hard bread. The brothers, without breaking their silence, closed their eyes as they chewed. He noticed that. It stayed with him long after the meal, and a spoonful of vinegar that had been smuggled from a passing trader. Fast days. The abbey calendar was a tide, pulling him forward, dragging him back. And through it all, he endured, with cracked hands, with a burnt sleeve, with quiet pride that no one ever named. His prayers were made through work, his blessings carried in baskets of salted trout. He never held a crucifix in the kitchen, but he held the sacred all the same boiling, salting, solving, serving, not for thanks, but because someone had to fish in the morning, fish at night, boiled, stewed, soaked, or fried when oil allowed. He would sit for a moment on the low stool near the door, watching the smoke rise into the dark. The scent of fish still clung to him, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like memory, like purpose, like the quiet trace of something holy. Fish, for all its faults, kept the abbey fed. It was a symbol of humility, of devotion, of sacrifice. And when the monks knelt in prayer, offering thanks for their meal, the cook felt those words pass through him too, even if unspoken. He was part of that chain. He was the one who took what the river and sea gave and turned it into something that could be shared. The smell that never quite left. The taste that turned bitter in late winter. There were nights when the cook, alone in his room behind the hearth, dreamed of bread, not fish, not barley. Just warm, soft bread with a golden crust and a smear of butter. He had tasted such a thing only once, years ago, when a merchant caravan passed through and offered him a roll in exchange for a bowl of soup. The memory returned often, uninvited. The stew was thick, warming, unexpected. The brothers ate with more focus than usual, and the reader at the pulpit stumbled over his scripture, distracted by the smell. Later that evening, the youngest novice approached the kitchen and, without stepping inside, left a single wildflower on the stone near the door. It was a silent thanks. The cook kept it in a shallow dish of water until it withered. The abbot nodded once in his direction before returning to his cell. It was the closest thing to praise he would ever receive. But fish had a way of lingering, not just in the kitchen, but in the memory. Certain meals stuck with the cook. Not because they were praised, but because they went wrong, or nearly did, and had to be salvaged in silence. He remembered one Friday when the morning's fish delivery never came. The usual fisherman had fallen ill, and the barrel expected from the village had not arrived. There was no dried stock left in the pantry, no salted pieces curled in linen. Nothing but a single bucket of bones and scraps that would normally go to the pigs. The cook looked at the meager remains, his mind already scanning for a solution. He boiled water, added oats, stirred in the last of the dried leeks, then carefully dropped in the fish bones, watching the cloudy broth swirl as it pulled flavor from the marrow and skin. There were days when he envied the fish themselves, caught, prepared, served, and then forgotten. No one questioned the fish. No one expected it to speak. It simply arrived and did what it was meant to do. Some days, the cook imagined himself the same way, quiet, necessary, invisible. Other days, that thought weighed on him. It was not bitterness, not exactly. Just the recognition that while the monks prayed with words and studied scripture with reverence, he prayed with firewood and gutting knives, with salted water and wooden spoons. He had learned over time how deeply the rhythm of fish consumption shaped the abbey. Once, on the feast of St. Brigid, he had managed to prepare a stew of fish with carrots, peas. But for every small success, there were weeks of sameness. Still, he remained faithful to his role. Not all fish were alike. There was one species pike that he loathed. Long, bony, with a strange taste that no amount of boiling could hide. And there were rare blessings. Years passed like this. Season after season, marked by fish. Lent, Easter, Advent, Saints' Days. And in the hush of twilight, when the last bowl had been rinsed and the fire settled into a slow glowing breath. Chapter 6. Pilgrims at the Gate. They came in small groups, usually at dawn or just before dusk. Pilgrims, wrapped in cloaks heavy with rain and road dust, hunched from days of walking, faces raw from wind. They did not knock. They simply waited, standing at the gate with their heads bowed, eyes lowered, until one of the brothers noticed them and fetched the guest master. Then, slowly and without ceremony, they were brought inside. Not into the cloister, not into the chapel, but into the guest quarters near the outer wall, a part of the abbey not much warmer than the road they had left behind. And once there, someone would come to the kitchen with word. The pilgrims had arrived. The cook rarely saw them. He heard about them, of course. The novices whispered their numbers, spoke of their limping walks, of children carried on shoulders or elderly women who had to be helped inside. The guest master would pass along a number, sometimes a list of dietary needs or illnesses. 3 men, all fasting, he might say. Or 1 mother and babe, weak with hunger. And with that, the cook would set to work. No one asked whether it was possible. No one considered what was already short. The expectation was simple. Feed them. Feed them now. Pilgrims did not eat with the brothers. They were served in a separate room, usually with less ceremony and fewer rules. The cook often repurposed food from the noon meal: extra barley, slices of dried apple, boiled roots if they had survived the morning sun. He always prepared a fresh pot of broth, even if it meant drawing more water from the well and feeding the fire again. The broth was simple vegetable stock, sometimes thickened with old oats, but it was warm, and that was what mattered most. He did not resent the pilgrims. He understood why they came: to touch relics, to say prayers in a chapel, to feel, even briefly, that they had stepped closer to the sacred. Some came to give thanks, others to beg for healing. Still, others simply to escape their lives for a while, to walk far enough that their sins felt smaller behind them. Whatever their reason, they arrived hungry, and he fed them. The challenge was never just the food. It was the timing. The cook's day was already measured down to the hour, his tasks carved into the daylight. Pilgrims upset that rhythm. They arrived late, they arrived in groups. They arrived unannounced during fasts, when there was no meat to give and no bread left unblessed. The rule demanded hospitality. The cook's own conscience agreed, but his resources did not always comply. On more than one occasion, he served half portions to the brothers to ensure the pilgrims had enough. He did this quietly, adjusting the ladle as he went, hoping no one noticed. But they did notice. Brother Irelaith, who always sat near the head of the table, once lingered after a meal and approached the kitchen door. The cook looked up from washing the pot and waited. Irelaith said nothing for a moment, then remarked, "There was less today." The cook nodded once. "For the pilgrims," he said. Irelaith paused, then simply replied, "I see," and walked away. No complaint followed, just understanding, tucked in silence. One spring, a group of 7 pilgrims arrived, soaked to the bone. Their shoes were nearly worn through. They had walked from the west coast, following a trail of abbeys that formed a sacred circuit. The cook was told they would stay 2 nights. He examined his stores and realized there was barely enough to keep up. He would need to stretch everything, thin the porridge, add more water to the stew, use the last of the turnips. It would be close, but it could be done. On the second evening, as the rain pounded the roof and the wind crept through the stones, one of the pilgrims left a token near the kitchen entrance, a simple wooden carving of a fish small enough to fit in a palm. It was well worn, the grain smooth from years of handling. The cook held it in his hand for a long moment. There was no message, no name, just the fish. He placed it on the narrow shelf above the door, beside an old dried sprig of rosemary and a smooth river stone collected years earlier. It stayed there from that day forward, a quiet reminder that what he did mattered, even when no one said so. Pilgrims did not expect comfort. They expected pain, cold, hunger. The abbey offered them a reprieve, and the kitchen played its part in that. Some of them cried over the broth, not because it was rich and ever was, but because it was warm, and someone had made it for them. The cook often thought about that. The act of preparing food for someone who expected nothing, it was not charity. It was a form of recognition, a way to say you are here, and that matters. Occasionally, there were pilgrims who caused unease. One man arrived with a wound on his leg, badly wrapped, smelling of rot. The guest master hesitated, unsure whether to let him stay. The infirmarian finally agreed. After lighting incense and muttering a long prayer, the man was given food and a bed of straw. The cook was told to prepare something soft-boiled barley and milk, with no herbs, no salt. He did so without question. That night, the kitchen door creaked open. The pilgrim stood there, face hidden beneath a tattered hood, and said, "Thank you." Then he left. The wound had not healed. The straw remained warm, but he was gone. The cook never saw him again. It wasn't just the sick who lingered in memory. A girl once arrived with her grandfather. The old man walked with a carved stick, each step deliberate, each breath strained. The girl carried the basket. She smiled when she ate. Not out of joy, exactly, but out of wonder. As if she hadn't expected to be allowed inside. She left behind a woven ring of grass, tied at one edge with a red thread. The cook found it by the bench where she had sat. He didn't return it, he placed it with the fish carving. Another offering. In time, he came to see the pilgrims as part of the abbey itself, not interruptions, but reminders of the world outside, of need, of grace. They carried burdens he would never know, and he, in turn, carried theirs for a while. In bowls of soup, in bread softened in broth, in meals prepared not out of duty, but out of quiet reverence for those who had walked too far to be turned away. After many years, the cook had grown used to the unpredictability of the pilgrims. He could no longer count the number he had fed, but he remembered the shapes of them, the way a tired man's shoulders slumped as he accepted a bowl. Others, especially the older ones or those recovering from illness, stayed longer. In the evening, he added thin broth or soft peas, depending on what remained in the storeroom. The injured one rarely spoke. It bore no words, only the mark of a circle, drawn with careful pressure, surrounded by 5 short lines like rays of light. The cook found it later that day and kept it. When she finally left, she did not say goodbye. "Why must we serve those who do not stay?" one asked. The cook didn't answer directly. It stretched east and west, curving out of sight. He imagined the travelers moving along it, even now. Hunched figures in the dusk, faces turned downward against wind. Packs growing heavier with every mile. He imagined the stories they carried, the ones they told, the ones they kept locked away. He handed the boy a pot and pointed to the basin. Not a destination, but a resting place. And the kitchen, hot, cramped, filled with the scent of boiling grain, was one of its pillars. The cook did not travel, but through his work, he touched the journey of many. Each bowl served was a parting gift. Each meal, a pause between steps. He stocked barrels with dried beans, stacked peat near the hearth, soaked cloths to seal the window's cracks. And he waited for the knock, for the bell, for the quiet word that would mean someone new had come to the gate, tired and hungry. And when they did, he would rise once more. Not because he had to, but because he knew what it was to arrive somewhere empty and be met with a bowl of something warm. He did not need to know where they came from or where they went. It was enough to know they had arrived. As they scrubbed side by side in silence, the boy watched the cook's hands. He saw the cracks in the skin, the burns along the wrist, the way each movement was steady and sure. After a while, he didn't ask again. He understood. It was not about fairness. It was about duty. About offering something to those passing through without expecting a return. But the bundle on her back was lighter, the blanket gone. Whether she left it behind or buried it near the woods, no one knew. But something in her shoulders had changed. The cook felt the shift, though they had never spoken. He had no idea what it meant. Perhaps a local symbol, or a sign of gratitude in a language lost to him. A feather left by a pilgrim who had walked with a goose for protection. A fragment of sea glass, smooth and pale blue, pressed into his hand by a girl who never spoke. A scrap of parchment with the word "remember" written in. None of it held value, but all of it meant something. Together they formed a kind of relic, one not blessed by the church, but by the hands of strangers who had been fed, warmed, and allowed to rest. Still, he placed it with the others. A silent record of service. But on the third day, as the cook placed the bowl before him on the wooden tray, he said softly, "This is more than I expected." The cook did not respond. He only folded the cloth over the tray and stepped back. The young man ate slowly, his fingers shaking slightly as he brought the spoon to his lips. 3 men, one young, the others older, walking with rough staffs and callous feet. They spoke little, even among themselves. The youngest had an injury to his side, bandaged in cloth that smelled faintly of crushed garlic and moss. Some local remedy, poorly applied. A woman once arrived in the middle of the night, banging on the outer gate, soaked to the skin, shouting in a language none of the monks fully understood. She had walked alone, carrying a bundle strapped across her back. At first, they feared madness, but the guest master, with slow patience and hand signs, calmed her. She was brought to the shelter, fed warm broth, and allowed to sleep. When she woke, she spoke more clearly. Her child had died 2 weeks before. She had carried his small blanket wrapped against her shoulders the whole way, never stopping for long. She had come to the abbey because it was the last name she remembered from stories told in her youth. She did not ask for healing. She asked for quiet, for stillness, for something warm. The cook was told they would need soft food and a place to recover for several days. He nodded and began boiling oats before the sun had reached the tops of the cloister walls. A week, sometimes two. There were no formal limits. The guest master decided, guided by mercy and practical concern. During these longer stays, the strain on the kitchen deepened. A few extra mouths each day meant one more sack of grain emptied sooner, one more bundle of kindling burned before the week's end. But the cook never adjusted the quality of the food. Instead, he adjusted everything else. Smaller portions. More boiling, less baking. Bread served thinner. Broth thickened with yesterday's scraps. The fire was kept low until just before dawn, to stretch the peat supply. The rhythm remained the same, but the pressure beneath it swelled. The hunched silence of a widow resting on the bench by the kitchen wall, the eager hands of a young boy lifting a spoon too big for his mouth. They arrived like weather, sudden and without apology, and the cook responded as one might to a storm. Not with complaint, but with preparation. And when they passed on again, he did not follow their stories. He stayed with the hearth, the pot, and the needs of those yet to come. Some pilgrims stayed a single night. One cold autumn morning, after the frost had settled on the grass. Each morning during their stay, he prepared a meal of oat mash with milk and herbs. When the group left at the end of the week, one of the older men left a scrap of parchment tucked into the edge of the guest quarters' wooden bench. Not all pilgrim stories were quiet. The cook prepared her food without herbs or salt, simple barley and leeks, softened in milk. Sometimes the novices questioned the fairness of the work. On rare evenings when there were no pilgrims and the kitchen was clean, the cook would sit near the outer wall and watch the road. The abbey, for all its routine, remained part of that road. In time, the collection above the kitchen door grew. As another winter approached and the fires burned longer, the cook prepared for the season ahead. Chapter 7. The Kitchen Boy's Punishment. In the quiet world of the monastery, every role carried weight, but few bore it as early or as silently as the kitchen boys. They were not monks, not yet. Most were boys sent by families too poor to raise them or too devout to ignore the promise of religious life. They arrived at the abbey shy and wide-eyed, with rough hands and empty stomachs, and they were quickly put to work. The garden, the scriptorium, the stables, all had need of small hands, but the kitchen took in the ones who had no other skill. Those who could not read, could not tend to horses, could not sit still for hours copying Latin script. Here, in the heat and smoke, they found their test. The cook did not choose them. They were assigned to him, sometimes one at a time, sometimes two or three. Always young, always uncertain. Some cried at night, huddled in the corner of the scullery room. Others grew quiet, withdrawn, their eyes dark with exhaustion before the first week had passed. They rose before the dawn bell and washed pots with water so cold it turned their fingers white. They fetched firewood, scrubbed the floor, peeled vegetables until their wrists ached. The cook watched them closely. He did not speak much, but he missed nothing. Mistakes were common. A boy would drop a bowl or spill the oats or forget which pot held the lentils. Once, a new arrival mistook of precious dried peas for waste and fed the entire thing to the pigs. The abbot was furious. The boy was beaten behind the stable and sent to prayer without supper. The cook never said a word about it, but the next morning he gave the boy an extra slice of bread and showed him, silently, how to recognize the right sacks by the feel of the cloth. He never made the mistake again. But not all errors could be corrected so quietly. There was a rule in the abbey, known but rarely written, that sacred items were not to be touched by novices or helpers without explicit permission. The wine, in particular, was reserved for Mass. It was stored in the locked cabinet behind the pantry, rarely opened, counted with care. One afternoon, As the sun cast narrow beams through the high window, a kitchen boy named Eamon Young, curious, and always too quick, found the cabinet open. No one saw him take the bottle, but someone heard the glass break. The sound of shattering echoed across the cloister like thunder. The kitchen fell silent. The cook walked slowly from the hearth, wiping his hands on a cloth. He found the boy crouched near the door, shards of green glass at his feet, red liquid spreading in a thick line across the stones. Eamon was pale, his hands trembling, eyes wide with fear. He began to stammer an explanation, but the cook raised one hand gently and said nothing. That evening, the boy was taken to the abbot. No one spoke during supper. The wine was not poured. The next day, Eamon did not return to the kitchen. He had been reassigned to stable work, cold, bitter, and lonely. He no longer looked the cook in the eyes when they passed in the corridor. He moved slowly, with the weight of shame wrapped around him like a second cloak. The cook never asked for him back, but he placed a small loaf of bread on the stable wall one morning, wrapped in cloth. It was gone by nightfall. Punishment in the abbey was rarely harsh by the standards of the outside world, but it was deeply felt. Silence could be sharper than whips, exclusion more painful than hunger. And in the kitchen, where everything was earned through sweat and stillness, even a single mistake could echo for weeks. The cook tried to shield the boys when he could. He assigned tasks suited to their abilities. He let them rest when their hands began to shake. But he could not undo the rules. The abbot's word was final. The rule, older than any of them, stood higher still. One boy, named Ronan, once dropped an entire pot of barley just as it was finished. The boiling mess spilled across the stones, soaking into the straw. Ronan stood frozen, tears forming in his eyes as the cook turned. But instead of scolding him, the cook knelt beside the mess and began scooping the barley into a bucket with his bare hands. Without a word, Ronan joined him. They worked in silence until every grain was gathered. It could not be served, of course. But that evening, Ronan ate it from a separate bowl, sitting near the hearth as the rest of the abbey dined on bread and peas. From that day forward, Ronan was the first to rise and the last to sleep. He learned quickly. He never dropped another pot. And when he finally left the kitchen to begin his training as a full novice, he paused at the door and left behind a wooden spoon he had carved himself. It was rough and uneven, but the cook placed it with the others' tokens left by those who had passed through, each one shaped by labor and silence. Over the years, many boys came and went. Some stayed only a season before being sent to other tasks. A few stayed longer, their silence growing into confidence. One or two even returned years later as full brothers, their robes clean, their faces calm. They would pass by the kitchen, glancing in for just a moment, their eyes catching on the old hearth, the soot-stained walls, the bent figures still tending to the fire. They did not speak. They did not need to. The cook saw them. He remembered. He never called them by name. He never asked what they had become. It was enough to know they had once stood beside him, hands raw from scrubbing, eyes wide from the weight of it all. He remembered the way they hesitated with the knife, the way they flinched at the heat, and he remembered how they kept going, despite it. The kitchen broke some boys, it hardened others, but it taught all of them the same thing, to serve without praise, to labor without reward, and to carry the work forward not in word but in motion. And for the cook, that was all that mattered. Not how well they prayed, not how beautifully they chanted, but whether they had learned to stir the pot without spilling, to knead the bread with care, and to understand the quiet strength it took to do these things day after day, unseen and uncelebrated. There were no official farewells for the boys who left the kitchen. When their time ended, either because they had proven themselves or failed too many times, they were reassigned by the abbot or quietly replaced without ceremony. Some received new robes and new duties. Others, more quietly, simply disappeared. A family reclaimed them. A sickness took them. A decision was made behind closed doors. The cook never asked where they went. It was not his place. But when a boy was gone, he felt it in the rhythm of the day, in the tasks that no longer had a second pair of hands to assist. The kitchen felt a little larger, a little emptier. For those who remained long enough to earn the cook's quiet approval, something changed. They learned to read his body language before being told. They began to move like part of the space. A glance toward the door meant fetch more wood. A pause near the herb shelf meant prepare the bundle. Over time, they spoke to one another in gestures alone, an unspoken language built from days of labor. And yet, despite this growing understanding, they were always one mistake away from punishment. It was not cruelty, it was structure. The abbey was built on obedience. And the kitchen, for all its noise and motion, was an extension of that structure. Fire, water, blade, and bowl, these were the elements of discipline. A knife left too close to the edge of the table could mean a sliced finger. A pot not stirred at the right moment could lead to a spoiled meal. The consequences were real, and they echoed. A single error could mean hunger for 80 men. A missed signal could invite rebuke from the abbot. And the boys, no matter how young, learned that their hands bore the same responsibilities as any elders. Once, during a summer feast, the kitchen had to prepare an elaborate meal. Roasted roots, seasoned broth, spiced bread from a visiting merchant's gift. The cook worked through the night, preparing the hearth, checking the stores, portioning the flour with precision. He assigned 2 of the older boys to watch the oven, turning the bread at exact intervals. It was a moment of trust, a rare gesture. But the boys, eager to impress one another, left their posts to watch the musicians rehearsing in the courtyard. The loaves burned, not beyond saving, but scorched enough to fill the kitchen with bitter smoke. The guests ate the bread in silence. The abbot's glance was sharp. The cook said nothing, but that night the boys were kept behind. They scrubbed the floor until the stones gleamed, then were made to kneel until the bell rang for matins. No words passed between them. Just silence, and the knowledge that their lesson had been learned. The punishments were never violent, but they carried weight. A missed meal, an hour of kneeling, a day of menial labor without speaking. For a boy used to the kitchen's rhythm, that absence of purpose was punishment enough. The cook did not strike. He did not shout. He simply withdrew attention. The warmth of the fire remained, but the companionship, the quiet gestures of instruction, vanished. And the boys felt it, deeply. Some boys, hardened by years of labor before the abbey, never flinched under this discipline. They accepted it as part of life. One boy, Sean, came from a village where food was scarce and silence meant safety. He obeyed every instruction without hesitation, never smiled, never cried. When he dropped a hot iron pot on his foot and limped for 3 days, he said nothing. The cook observed him closely. One night, while the others slept, the cook wrapped the boy's foot in a cloth, soaked in rosemary oil, placing it near the embers to warm. He left without waking him. The boy never acknowledged it, but his limp faded, and from that day forward, he arrived in the kitchen 10 minutes before anyone else. Others were more fragile. One boy, dear maid, could not stop weeping during his first week. Every mistake brought tears. Every sharp glance from the cook seemed to undo him. The other novices mocked him, but only once. The cook assigned them all to carry buckets from the well for an hour, over and over. After that, they stopped laughing. Dear maid slowly found his place. He became a careful worker, precise, thoughtful. He never spilled a drop. The kitchen gave him something the world outside hadn't: expectation, structure, and eventually quiet pride. There were also those who broke, not from a single punishment, but from the weight of quiet repetition. A boy named Lorcan came from a merchant family. He had never worked a day in his life before arriving. The smoke made him cough. The noise startled him. The silence frightened him. He tried, in his way. But he dropped things, moved too slowly, forgot tasks. The cook gave him time, gave him patience, but in the end Lorcan walked away. During evening prayers, he slipped from the cloister and was gone before the bells rang again. His sandals were found near the gate. He was never seen again. The cook never spoke of it. But that night, he sat longer than usual by the fire. He added wood twice, then a third time, letting the flames burn brighter than necessary, not in anger. But in reflection, not every boy was meant for the kitchen. Not every hand could hold the weight of silence and heat. But the ones who stayed, who endured, he remembered all of them. Not their faces always, but their movements, their efforts, their small acts of courage. He had no sons, no family name, no legacy carved in stone. But the kitchen had its own memory. The spoon marks on the cauldron, the worn edge of the chopping block, the row of little tokens on the shelf above the bread bin. Each one a piece of a boy who had passed through, made mistakes, learned, and grown. The punishments had been necessary, but they were never the point. The goal was not to break. It was to teach. And so the cook continued. He trained the next boy and the one after that. He corrected with quiet hands, guided with watchful eyes. And when they faltered, as all boys did, he made them kneel not to shame them, but to remind them that strength comes not from success, but from the willingness to rise again after failing. In the hush of the kitchen, where the only sound was the steady breath of the fire and the soft scrape of spoon on stone, he shaped them, not into perfect monks, not into flawless servants, but into something better. Into men who could endure heat, silence, failure, and still choose to continue. And that, to him, was worth every spilled pot, every burnt loaf, every tear wiped silently with a sleeve. Chapter 8, Brewing for the Brethren. Behind the kitchen, down a narrow set of stone steps worn smooth by generations of footsteps, was the brewing room. It was darker than the kitchen, cooler even on summer days, and carried a scent the cook could recognize from anywhere in the abbey, something between damp straw, warmed grain, and the faint sour tang of fermenting yeast. The brothers called it the brew cellar. But the cook thought of it simply as the quiet room. Not many entered. Not because it was forbidden, but because few understood its rhythm. It was not enough to follow a recipe. Brewing was an act of patience and intuition, something that could not be taught with words alone. The abbey's ale was not brewed for pleasure. It was brewed for nourishment. During long fasts, when meals were restricted, the ale carried calories and warmth. When illness swept through the cloisters, it soothed aching throats. Even during regular days, a cup of weak ale at supper helped the older brothers sleep. It was considered medicinal, almost sacred in its function, and the task of brewing it fell to the cook by tradition and by necessity. No one else had the hands for it. No one else knew how to listen for the right bubbles, smell the difference between young wort and spoiled mash, or judge the right moment to move the mixture from the vat to the barrel. It began with grain, usually barley or oats, soaked in cold water until the husks softened. Then came the mashing, stirring the grain in hot water until it released its sugars. The liquid that resulted, called wort, was then boiled with herbs. Hops were rare in Ireland during the early centuries, so the cook used what he had: yarrow, heather, sometimes sweet gale if it could be found in the marshes. These herbs gave the ale its bitterness, but also acted as preservative and prayer. The right blend kept the brew from turning sour. The wrong one spoiled days of work. There was no set schedule. The cook brewed when the barrels ran low, which they often did after feast days or when the infirmary saw a surge in patients. He had 3 wooden vats, each with its own character. One was older, carved with symbols so worn they could no longer be read. Another leaked slightly and had to be wrapped in cloth near the base. The third, newer and smoother, still held the scent of fresh wood. He treated them all like tools and companions, inspecting them with care, repairing them in silence. A crack in the wood could ruin everything. So he listened as much as he watched, knocking the sides with his knuckles, waiting for the solid, hollow thump that meant the barrel was sound. Brewing days were long. He started before prime, often before the sun rose, and finished only after the last barrel was sealed. The work was physical in a different way from cooking. There was more lifting, more carrying, more exposure to scalding water and heavy wooden tools, and yet the pace was slower. There was waiting between steps, waiting for the mash to steep, waiting for the wort to boil, waiting for the room to fill with the sweet, malty scent that signaled the sugars had released their blessing. During those hours of waiting, the cook would often sit near the doorway, sipping water from a clay cup, his hands resting on his knees. He did not nap. He could not afford to. A boil left too long could overflow. A mix left unstirred could scorch. Instead, he breathed slowly, letting the smells and sounds of the brew cellar fill him, the quiet bubbling of yeast, the crackle of fire beneath the vat, the soft hiss of steam rising toward the ceiling. It was during one such moment, years earlier, that the abbot had entered the brew cellar unannounced. He was older then, walking with a slight limp, his hands folded behind his back. He did not speak right away. He simply stood beside the cook, watching the steam rise. After a time, he asked, "Do you think the Lord minds that we brew ale?" The cook, surprised by the question but too wary for cleverness, replied, "Only if it's poor." The abbot had laughed, then quietly, but with warmth, and patted the cook's shoulder before leaving. The moment stayed with him. Not because of the words, but because of the rare sound of laughter in the brew cellar, a sound usually reserved for feast halls and festivals. There were occasional mishaps, a batch that turned cloudy, a barrel that refused to seal. Once, a novice mistook the fermenting vat for waste and tried to dump its contents outside. The cook arrived just in time to stop him. The ale was saved, but the novice was not seen in the brew cellar again. Another time, a rat chewed through a rope that held a vitid's cover in place, and the spoiled ale had to be poured out, one slow ladle at a time, its sweet promise lost to the earth. These losses were not spoken of. They were absorbed, like all failures in the abbey, into the rhythm of the day. The brothers did not often speak of the ale. They drank it from wooden cups, heads bowed, the way they did everything else. But there were signs. An older monk sighing gently after the first sip, a novice wiping the rim of his cup with something like reverence. The cook noticed. He remembered. And when he brewed again, he carried those memories in his hands. Brewing was not part of the rule, but it had become part of the abbey's soul. A quiet tradition. A gift given without fanfare. And for the cook, it was something close to prayer. Not in words, not in gestures, but in action. The preparation, the care, the watching, the waiting, the quiet trust that the yeast would rise, the barrel would seal, the ale would last through the next fast. And when the day was done and the barrels lined the wall like sentinels, the cook would sit once more near the fire, the scent of grain still clinging to his robe, his hands still damp from scrubbing the vat. He did not drink the ale often, but he would sometimes raise a cup to his lips just enough to taste and nod to himself, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement. The work was done, the brew would hold, and the brothers would be fed in ways they did not see. The ale was not simply nourishment. It was memory, history, and presence. Long before the cook had taken his place at the hearth, others had stirred the same grain, whispered the same silent prayers as the mash thickened, and tasted the same faint bitterness left behind by wild herbs. The abbey's brewing traditions were not written down. They lived in calloused hands, in the feel of warm steam against the face, in the instinctive pause before lifting a barrel lid. And though he would never claim mastery, the cook had inherited this knowledge with care, not for recognition, but for continuity. Because the monks would always need the ale, just as surely as they needed bread and fire. Every so often, a batch was made not for daily use, but for sacred celebration, Christmas, Easter, the feast day of the abbey's patron saint. On these occasions, the cook changed the recipe slightly. He used sweeter grains if they were available. Sometimes he stirred in crushed apples or a drop of honey kept hidden beneath the salt sacks. These additions were small, barely noticeable to those who drank with indifference. But to the few who paid attention, the warmth lingered a little longer on the tongue. The color deepened. The texture thickened. It was not indulgence. It was offering. Once, during a winter feast, a merchant traveling from the East Coast visited the abbey with a gift, a bundle of dried hops, unfamiliar to many of the brothers. He had heard of the cook's skill and offered the hops with a knowing smile. The cook accepted them with a nod, more out of curiosity than expectation. He studied them for a full day before deciding to brew a small batch with the pungent cones. The result was sharper than his usual ale, less soft, more assertive. The brothers were surprised, some wincing, others intrigued. The abbot sipped his slowly, then set the cup down and said, "Only it speaks more loudly than we do." The cook took that as a compliment. But for all the craft, there were still limitations. The abbey's brewing depended on the grain harvest, on clean water from the well, on the unpredictable behavior of yeast. At least once a year, a batch would fail souring before it aged, turning cloudy, developing a strange film that coated the inside of the barrel. When this happened, the cook carried the cask out beyond the walls, past the herb garden, and poured the ale into the soil. He did so without ceremony, without witnesses. There was no shame in the failure, only the understanding that nature would not always obey, no matter how well the brew cellar was tended. He once taught a young novice how to begin the process, step by step, in hopes that someone would eventually carry the knowledge forward. The boy, diligent and careful, followed the instructions to the letter, but something in the brew lacked soul. The taste was flat, the texture too thin. The cook did not scold him. Instead, he handed the boy a spoon, guided his hand over the steaming mash, and said, "Feel it, don't just measure." After that, the novice began to understand, not how to brew perfectly, but how to listen, how to trust his senses. He never became a full brewer, but he carried the lesson with him. Years later, the cook saw him teaching another novice to mix herbs for the infirmary and recognized the same patience in his gestures. The relationship between brewing and healing was closer than most realized. When a monk fell ill, the infirmarian often requested ale, not strong, but steady, something to keep the stomach calm and the spirits from fading. The cook would prepare it in small batches, boiled gently, seasoned with elderflower or thyme depending on the symptoms. He knew which brothers could take it warm and which needed it cooled. For those who could no longer swallow food, he soaked bread in ale and pressed it into soft pulp. Sometimes, when death crept close, a few drops of ale were offered not as a cure, but as a comfort, a last warmth on the tongue. He remembered Brother Donchad, who spent his final days in the infirmary wrapped in woolen blankets, barely able to lift his head. The cook had known him for decades, a quiet man who copied texts with meticulous care. When the time came, the infirmarian sent for a final batch of ale, sweetened with apple and cinnamon. The cook prepared it himself, stirring slowly, tasting it 3 times to ensure the balance was right. It was brought to Donchad in a small wooden cup. He drank half, smiled faintly, and whispered, "It tastes like October." He died the next morning. The cook did not attend the funeral mass. He remained in the brew cellar, cleaning the vat with extra care, as if honoring the memory and labor. He lit a small candle, placed it near the wall, and let it burn down through the afternoon. No one mentioned it, but the infirmarian later sent a note with a single line. He slept peacefully. That was enough. There was something monastic in the brewing itself, something that mirrored the lives of the brothers who drank it. Both required repetition. Both demanded patience. Both were rooted in quiet discipline, and like the monks, the ale had no voice. It served without speaking. It offered comfort without demanding attention. It lived in the background, present, sustaining, uncelebrated. Each season, the cook adjusted the process. When the grain was poor, he soaked it longer. When the water ran muddy, he filtered it through cloth and prayed it would clear. There were no guarantees, only care, only trust. And in that he found meaning. When the work was done and the barrels were sealed, he wiped his hands on his robe and sat near the door. The room was quiet, the steam fading, the scent of grain lingered. Sometimes, in those moments, he thought of all the hands that would lift a cup, unaware of the labor behind it. He did not mind. It was better that way. The best things, he believed, were those that passed quietly between people, nourishing them without spectacle. And so, the brew cellar remained his sanctuary. Not a holy place in a traditional sense, but sacred all the same. A room of fire, wood, and patience, of failure and learning, of bitter herbs and slow reward, a place where nothing spoke, yet everything mattered. Chapter 9. The Hunger Year of 1315. It began with rain. Not a downpour, not a storm, but a persistent, quiet wetness that settled over the land like a second sky. By the third day, the garden paths turned to mud. By the seventh, the lower fields near the river had flooded. And by the end of the month, the grain was rotting in the ground. The cook watched it happen from the cloister walk, his eyes drifting beyond the stone walls to the edges of the vegetable beds, where the cabbage leaves had begun to yellow and slump under the weight of too much water. It was early summer. The harvest should have been setting, but instead everything softened. Everything sank. The brothers did not panic, not at first. The abbey had seen bad weather before, a spoiled harvest here, a lean month there. They had preserved grain in the storeroom and dried herbs hanging in bunches from the rafters. The cook examined the stores. 6 sacks of barley, 3 of oats, dried peas and beans, some hard cheese sealed in wax. The root cellar held turnips, onions, and the last of last winter's apples, shriveled but edible. It would be enough. It had to be. But the rain did not stop. It thickened, turned the road to the village into a sucking trench, cut off trade, spoiled the hay. The garden plants turned black at the base. The herb beds began to mold. Each morning, the cook peeled another soft layer from the carrots, hoping the core was still good. By midsummer, he was boiling meals that tasted more of water than food. The monk said nothing, but he saw it. The slower steps, the deepening silences at the table. Even the readings from the pulpit grew shorter, as if saving energy. Then came word from the village. Livestock were dying. Fields wouldn't dry. Children were going without meals. The abbey, as it had done before, opened its gate to the desperate. Pilgrims became beggars. Local farmers arrived on foot, soaked and hollow-eyed, asking for anything. A scrap of bread, a bowl of broth. The cook was told to prepare meals for them, but there was little to give. He began to thin the soup further, stretching one pot to feed 20 instead of 10. He boiled bread crusts in the broth to add texture. He set aside his own meals without being asked. The abbey's rule of hospitality remained firm. No one who came in need was turned away. But behind that welcome was quiet strain. The cook now measured every grain. He adjusted the rations without permission. He knew how far the sacks could stretch, and he did what he had to. A handful of oats became a full bowl when boiled long enough, when mixed with cabbage water, when thickened with faith. The worst part was the silence. No one complained. No one cried out. The hunger settled like fog dull, constant, inescapable. The brothers carried on. They sang their psalms. They copied their texts. They repaired the abbey roof. But their robes hung looser. Their cheeks grew hollow. The cook heard them waking earlier, pacing more at night. He began waking even earlier, praying over the grain sacks before opening them. Not with words, but with touch, as if hoping that his care alone could make them last. One morning, he opened the final sack of barley. It was smaller than he remembered, lighter. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. There was enough for 2 more meals if stretched properly. After that, they would be at the mercy of the fields or of God. He said nothing to the brothers. He simply set to work, boiling the grains with turnip skins and thickened broth, slicing the last onions, so thin they were translucent. The infirmary began to fill, not with plague, but with weariness. The monks who had once marched confidently to prayer now leaned on each other. The novices grew pale, moved slowly through their chores. The cook adjusted the ingredients again, brewing ale with more sweetness, hoping it would settle their stomachs. He returned to old methods, gathering nettle-line roots from near the walls, drying mint and yarrow in the kitchen's heat. Nothing was wasted now, not even peels. Not even the water used to rinse the pots. The abbot did not speak of the famine openly, but one evening, as the cook passed him in the corridor, the abbot placed a hand on his shoulder and held it there for a moment longer than usual. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The cook understood what was being asked. He would hold the line, hold the hearth, for as long as he could. In the garden, little remained. The rain had relented slightly, but the ground stayed soggy. The few surviving cabbages were small and bitter. The herb bed had collapsed. And still, the villagers came, and still, the cook served them. He no longer used bowls. He handed food in cups, ladled into hands, pressed into bits of cloth. The broth grew thinner, the silence deeper. And yet within the hunger, there was something else, a kind of resilience. The kitchen boys who remained no longer asked for rest. They moved with care, with seriousness, slicing roots like sacred tasks. One of them, a boy named Kaolin, began collecting wood scraps from the carpenter's shop to fuel the fire. Another took to trapping small game in the garden rabbits, once ignored, now welcomed. The cook did not ask where the meat came from. He simply prepared it, blessing the hands that brought it. As the days passed, he could feel the abbey shift. It was no longer just a place of prayer. It had become a place of survival. The chapel bells still rang, but they rang over empty fields. The songs were sung by tired voices. The relics remained, but now they served as reminders, not of miracles, but of endurance. The cook found himself speaking aloud again, if only briefly, when alone in the brew cellar or garden. Not in full sentences, just names, memories. He remembered the meals of better years, the laughter that once echoed after feast days. He whispered those things, not to call them back, but to keep them near. The hunger year of 1315 had arrived quietly, with no proclamation, no thunder, just rain, and then silence. But in the kitchen, the cook stood firm. He had no sword, no scripture, only pots and grain and fire. And with these, he fought the famine as best he could, not to conquer it, but to outlast it, one bowl at a time. By early autumn, the desperation had settled into the stone. The abbey's walls, once weather-worn but proud, now seemed smaller, hunched under the gray weight of the sky. The rains had never fully stopped. They came less often, but with the same stubborn persistence. The cook rose before first light every morning and felt it first in his knees, the cold dampness that clung to the earth and crept into the joints. He wrapped his robe tighter and listened for movement in the kitchen corridor, half expecting that one of the brothers would not rise. But every day they came. Fewer, slower, but still moving, still praying, still waiting for what little could be prepared. The barley was gone. So were the oats. The root cellar held a few wrinkled turnips, a single basket of withered apples, and some sprouting onions, their green shoots curling into the air like pleading hands. The cook lined the inside of bowls with cabbage leaves to give the appearance of fullness, then spooned in broth made from bones and herbs. He had begun collecting wild mushrooms from the forest edge carefully, cautiously. He had grown up with knowledge of which were safe and which brought pain, and that knowledge now served more than just his memory. One false step could mean illness. The line between healing and harm had grown so thin. The bread was no longer baked. There was no flour left, no yeast strong enough to rise. The oven remained cold, a stone relic from better times. The cook kept it clean anyway, brushing out the ashes, as if some part of him refused to let it fall into disuse entirely. A symbol, perhaps, or simply habit. Either way, he did not abandon it. The garden, once vibrant, was now stripped bare. The cook still walked its rows each day, searching for anything edible. A few dandelions, a clump of wood sorrel. He picked them with gentle fingers and whispered their names under his breath, not as spells, but as a kind of litany. A way to remind himself that life could still be named, even in famine. He kept a basket by the door of the kitchen for these foraged greens, adding them to broth in handfuls that never seemed enough. The monks had begun to show the deeper signs of starvation, not just thinner faces, but hollowed-out strength. A brother fainted during prayer. Another collapsed in the garden. The infirmarian, overburdened and undersupplied, turned to the cook with quiet eyes and quiet requests. Anything soft, anything warm, anything that would stay in the stomach. The cook responded as best he could, boiling the last of the dried beans, steeping herbs in warm water, soaking hardened bread ends in ale until they could be chewed. It was not just the monks who suffered. The villagers who came for help were thinner now, their eyes desperate, their hands shaking as they reached for food. The cook had begun keeping a ledger in his mind, how many mouths, how many days, how much could be spared. He no longer relied on measurements. He worked by instinct, by rhythm, by prayer without words. One day, a mother arrived with two small children, their limbs stick-thin, their hair clinging to their foreheads in damp clumps. The brothers brought them inside without question. The cook made a pot of broth from the last handful of dried peas, added what soft roots he could find, and ladled it carefully into small cups. The children sipped slowly, eyes wide, lips trembling. The mother wept not loudly. Just a single breath held too long, then released. Afterward, when they had been taken to rest near the infirmary hearth, the cook stepped outside and sat on the low stone bench by the herb wall. He watched the sky. It was flat and colorless, without wind or motion. Just gray. He closed his eyes for a moment, just to breathe, just to listen to something other than need. He thought of harvest festivals from years past, tables lined with bread, baskets of apples, honey glazed on thick cuts of pork. He remembered laughter echoing through the cloisters, songs sung at sunset, monks breaking fast with a kind of joy that now felt like memory from another lifetime. And yet he did not long for feasts. He longed for sufficiency, for the peace that came with enough. Inside, the kitchen boys worked without needing to be told. They cleaned the bowls, rinsed the pots, wiped the wooden table. Their faces were solemn, but composed. They had grown beyond their age. In hunger, they had learned something deeper than obedience. They had learned empathy. And the cook, watching them, felt something stir. Not pride, not exactly, but quiet recognition. They were enduring. That was enough. When another shipment of grain finally arrived, a small cart pulled by a gaunt mule, escorted by two monks from a neighboring abbey, it was like seeing light break across a frozen pond. The cook touched the sack gently, feeling the rough weave beneath his fingers. The grain inside was dry, blessedly dry. He said nothing. He simply carried it inside, divided it into portions, and began to prepare the first pot of true porridge. The aroma that rose from the pot was thin, but familiar. A scent the brothers had not smelled in some time. It drifted through the corridors. It filled the chapel during prayer. It clung to their robes as they sat at the table. The cook watched them eat slowly, reverently, as if remembering how. He ate nothing himself, not out of martyrdom, but because he had already been fed by the act of giving, by the return of rhythm. That evening he returned to the garden and knelt in the mud. He did not pray in words. He simply ran his fingers through the soil. It was soft, damp, but it no longer carried the stench of rot. He pressed a seed into the earth, covered it, and moved on to the next. He had saved a handful of them old seeds, forgotten in a clay jar near the bottom of the pantry. He had no idea if they would grow, but he planted them anyway. The hunger had not ended. The famine had not passed. But the cook felt something shift in the weight of the day. A breath. A space between needs. A moment to hold on to. He returned to the kitchen and added a handful of barley to the cooling pot, then stirred it slowly. The fire crackled, low and patient. The night stretched on, quiet and long. But this time it did not feel empty. It felt like survival. It felt like a promise, whispered not with words, but with warmth. Chapter 10, The Dissolution of Irish Monasteries, Segment 1. It didn't arrive as fire or sword, not at first. The end of the abbey began with parchment. A letter, sealed and stamped, delivered on horseback by a man who didn't dismount. The abbot took it in silence. The brothers gathered that evening in the chapter house, their candles throwing long shadows against the cold stone walls. The parchment was read aloud. It spoke of changes in the church. It spoke of lands being reclaimed, of reforms, of property reassigned to the crown. The words were clear, but not immediate. They fell over the brothers like mist, uncertain, unsettling, but not yet solid. For the cook, the change was not in scripture, but in silence. After the letter, the abbey did not sound the same. The halls still echoed with footsteps, but the rhythm had changed. Less steady, more cautious. The bells still rang for prayer, but fewer voices answered. There was no decree to stop cooking, no proclamation to halt the meals, yet everything felt tentative. He boiled his pots as usual, stirred porridge at dawn, measured grain and sliced roots. But each act felt more like memory than motion. Soon after, men in dark cloaks arrived. Officials, they said, sent from Dublin. They walked the grounds with ledgers and quills, counting things, counting everything. Parchments, relics, chalices, bowls, barrels, books. They stepped into the kitchen, lifted lids, tapped the stone walls, noted the firewood stack. One of them asked the cook how many mouths he fed each day. The cook replied without looking up, all of them. The man did not write that down. They came and went, then came back again. The second time, they brought maps. Lines drawn over land the abbey had farmed for generations. Fields once tilled by monks were now labeled in someone else's hand. The cook saw the maps left on a table one night and read them by the low flicker of the kitchen hearth. His garden was marked as Parcel 17. There were no arguments, no resistance. Not because the brothers agreed, but because they were bound by silence. That was the rule, and so they obeyed in stillness. But the stillness was no longer sacred. It felt like waiting. Some of the younger brothers began to leave, quietly, without ceremony. A missing robe, an empty cot, a name no longer called during roll. The cook watched them go and did not stop them. He understood. It was not rebellion. It was mourning in motion. Then came the order to reduce. Not just prayer, not just ceremony, but people. The kitchen was the first to feel it. Fewer mouths now, said the abbot one evening. So fewer pots. The cook nodded. He cleaned the large cauldron and hung it from the back beam. He began using the smaller pot, the one reserved for feast days. The soup no longer stretched. It no longer needed to. The food itself began to change. Less variety. Fewer deliveries from nearby farms. No more dried fruits. No honey. Salt became scarce. Herbs wilted from lack of care. The cook tried to maintain the rhythm, but the melody had changed. He adjusted recipes without flavor. It kept the kitchen warm, though fewer bodies passed through its door. He began walking the outer walls again in the evenings, past the orchard, past the granary, to the gate that once welcomed pilgrims and poor alike. It was now chained shut, not for fear of attack, but to keep out the past. One night, he saw smoke on the horizon, another abbey, perhaps, or a village resisting the same changes. He said nothing. He turned back toward the garden. Weeds had begun to reclaim the paths. The mint had died out. The thyme grew wild, unpruned. He picked a small bundle anyway, out of habit more than hope. Letters kept arriving, each thinner than the last. Each with more names, more signatures. Latin faded. English took its place. Titles shifted. Prior became custodian. Sanctuary became property. Even the chapel books were removed, carried out in crates. The cook helped pack them, not because he was asked, but because he could not bear to see them handled without care. One morning, he awoke to find the refectory empty. No one at table, no prayer over bread, no quiet scraping of wooden spoons, just the long, low creak of the wind through the open windows. The meal that day was not served. It was simply placed on the table and left. The next day, word came that the abbey would be closed. Dissolved. The word itself was strange. Like something melting, not ending. The cook stood in the kitchen, looking at the pots, the stone hearth, the wooden spoon polished smooth by decades of use. He did not weep. He did not rage. He began to scrub. If the abbey was to be taken, he would leave it clean. That was his vow now, not to the church, not to the crown, but to the place itself. He cleaned the walls. He swept the floor. He burned the old linens, the ones too torn to be repurposed. He salted the stone sink to clear the smell. He polished the ladle and placed it upright in its hook. Then he sat once more beside the fire and waited. The day of the final inspection arrived with clear skies. Men in cloaks, guards in boots, horses tethered outside the gate. The brothers were gathered in the chapel. Some prayed. Some stood still. The abbot gave a short blessing half sermon, half goodbye. The cook did not attend. He remained in the kitchen. It was all he had known, all he had made his own. When the footsteps came, he stood. He nodded to the man who entered. The man did not return it. He walked the room slowly, inspecting, then turned to leave. That night, the cook remained in the kitchen long after the doors were locked. He sat with the fire one last time. He boiled water, not for food, but for memory. He let the steam rise. He let the warmth fill the air. Then he extinguished it gently and walked out without looking back. The abbey would become something else, a manor, a ruin, a fieldstone quarry. But in that kitchen, for decades, something had been made that no letter could erase. A quiet rhythm, a sacred labor, a place where hunger was met with care, a place now gone, but not lost. The weeks following the closure passed without rhythm. Where once every hour of the cook's life had been measured by bells, chants, and prayer, now there was only unmarked time. The abbey's stone walls remained standing, but something essential had vanished from within them. A monastery without its monks was not a monastery. It was stone without breath, silence without spirit. The cook found himself walking the grounds with no destination, his feet following old paths through gardens that no longer needed tending, toward a kitchen with no mouths to feed. He did not leave when the others did. Some brothers returned to their families. Others scattered across the countryside, finding refuge in hidden cells or at sympathetic landowners. A few went south, hoping for better news from the larger cities, though none returned. The abbot had left quietly in the night, his departure marked only by the absence of his walking stick by the chapel door. No farewell, no last blessing. The cook had watched from the shadows of the kitchen as the abbot's figure passed beneath the gate arch and disappeared into the fog. He did not try to stop him. In the empty abbey, the cook moved slowly. He swept the chapel even though no one prayed there. He lit the kitchen hearth, though no broth would be stirred. He walked the cloisters, touching the stone walls with the tips of his fingers as if reassuring them or himself that something holy still clung to the surface. His world had not ended in fire or blood. It had ended in paperwork, in policy, in quiet footsteps that took away centuries of routine. He began speaking aloud again, not to anyone in particular, just to the kitchen, to the bread oven, to the worn bench where the novices once peeled onions and whispered jokes when they thought he wasn't listening. His voice was rough from disuse, but it filled the space. It gave the walls something to carry. One morning, he found a bird had nested in the rafters of the refectory. A small gray thing, barely more than feathers and air, but it had brought in twigs, moss, and thread. It made a life where life had left. The cook smiled, and for the first time in many weeks, he hummed a small tune as he carried water from the well. He did not know what day it was. There were no calendars now. But he decided to make bread. There was no yeast left, no flour. But he found a handful of old grain near the bottom of the pantry, a forgotten pouch, untouched by battalion officials. He ground it with a stone, mixed it with water, and let it rest by the last warm embers of the hearth. It would not rise, but it would be bread of a kind. He baked it slowly, turning it often, watching the surface crack and harden. When it cooled, he broke it into pieces and left them on a wooden plate near the chapel door for the bird, for any traveler who might wander in. Sometimes he imagined someone would come, a poor farmer, a curious child, a monk who had refused to surrender his robe. He rehearsed what he would say, how he would explain the abbey's fall, but no one came. Only the wind and the creaking doors remained, and yet he stayed, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because this place was made of his labor, his prayers, his sweat. He had stirred soup for decades, buried brothers, brewed ale through famine. He had watched boys become men, watched men become names in the abbey ledger. If he left, who would remember them? One afternoon, he ventured outside the walls, past the old orchard where apples no longer grew, to the far edge of the abbey's land. The fields had gone wild grass as high as his waist, hedgerows untamed, but among them he saw remnants of paths, stone boundaries where gardens once lay. He sat beneath the largest oak tree, the one the brothers called the Silent Bell because it rang with crows each morning. There, he ate a piece of the hard bread and drank cool water from a leather pouch. It was not a feast, but it was enough. That night, he wrote in the Abbey ledger, not a prayer, not a record of supplies, but a memory. He wrote of the kitchen, of the soup ladle with the knot in its handle, of Brother Sharon, who always requested extra turnips, of the time it snowed so heavily that the oven froze shut and they had to eat raw oats for 3 days. He wrote slowly, carefully, as if carving each word into stone. He did not write about the officials. He did not write about the closure, only the life that had filled the place before it faded. Winter came quickly that year. Cold seeped through the empty halls. Ice formed on the insides of windows. The cook gathered what little he had, blankets, dried wood, some old carrots buried beneath straw. He moved his sleeping mat near the kitchen hearth and burned a fire every night. He slept in the same place he had worked for so long. The silence no longer frightened him. It was familiar now, like a final chant at dusk. One morning, he awoke to the scent of something sweet, not from his own hands, from memory. He dreamed someone had baked honey bread, that the chapel bells had rung again, that the brothers had filed into the refectory with smiles. He sat up alone and found the room unchanged, but for a moment the warmth of that dream lingered, and he allowed himself to believe that somewhere, perhaps in another abbey untouched by maps and seals, monks were still singing, still boiling soup, still baking bread. By the end of that winter, the cook no longer left the abbey walls. His legs were weaker, his breath shorter. But each morning he lit a fire, stirred a pot, even if it held only water, and greeted the kitchen with a nod. The place had cared for many, and now he would care for it. One day he did not rise. The fire remained unlit, the pot unfilled, and in the stillness the bird returned, nesting once more above the rafters. The wind passed softly through the stone, lifting the scent of herbs long dried. The abbey stood empty and full, not forgotten, not erased, but resting. Chapter 11. Ancient Celtic Christian Crosses and Lore. Before the first stone of the abbey was ever laid, there had been standing stone's weather-worn slabs of granite, rising from the earth like frozen sentinels. The monks never spoke of them directly, yet they walked past them daily, their sandals brushing the moss-covered roots, their fingers occasionally tracing the faint spirals carved long before St. Patrick had arrived. In Ireland, faith was never entirely new. It grew like ivy over what had already stood, and the monastery, for all its rules and rituals, was no exception. The cook had not always noticed these older marks. When he was a novice, his focus had been on the grain sacks, the firewood, the endless repetition of meals. But over time, he began to see them patterns hidden in chapel windows, lots in the wood of the benches, etched crosses with arms that curled like vines. These were not the plain crosses of Rome, but the ringed ones of the island, where Christianity had wound itself around older roots. In the corner of the garden stood one such cross taller than a man, carved from dark stone, worn smooth by centuries of wind and prayer. Its arms formed a perfect circle, a sun-wheel, some said, from a time when gods had worn antlers and walked barefoot through forests. Now it stood beside the herb bed. The cook often sat near it in the evenings, resting after long days of chopping and boiling. He never prayed aloud there, but he listened. To the wind, to the birds, to the slow, deep silence that seemed to gather around the stone. He began to notice patterns. Certain herbs grew better near the cross: angelica, mugwort, mint. He did not question it. The monks believed the cross blessed the soil. He accepted that. Others said the stone remembered things, that the earth beneath it had been sacred since long before Latin was spoken here. The cook did not argue. He did not need answers, only understanding. There were stories too, not written in books, but passed in quiet words between old brothers. Stories of saints who had learned from druids, of abbots who carried staffs carved with ancient symbols, of prayers that included the names of stars and rivers. The abbey's rituals had absorbed these echoes. Candlelit vigils held on solstices, blessings spoken over wells. Bread marked with not only a cross, but sometimes a spiral, pressed into the dough with a fingertip before baking. The cook followed these customs not because he believed in magic, but because they had always worked. When he brewed ale, He traced the circle over the vat before sealing it. When he planted seeds, he murmured the old verse, not Latin, but older, something about roots and sky, learned long ago from a brother who had since passed. The verse had no direct translation, but its rhythm soothed the soil. One night, near midsummer, the cook ventured to the edge of the orchard, where a ring of stones stood in a shallow clearing. Few brothers came here, though it was not forbidden. The stones had no markings, no cross, no name. But the cook brought with him a small loaf of bread, newly baked, and a handful of herbs. He placed them on the central stone, as he had seen a shepherd do once in his youth. A gift, he supposed, or a gesture of respect. Then he stood silently, his hands folded, and waited. For nothing, for everything. In the chapel, the stained glass windows bore images of saints, each framed by curling leaves and vines. It was said the glazier had come from Connaught and had learned his craft from those who carved ogum on standing stones. The images were not violent, no martyrdom, no fire. Just calm faces, open hands, halos that glowed like moonlight. And behind them always the pattern, the never-ending knot, the circle without break. Eternity, the monks called it, or protection, or the turning of the seasons. The cook had begun to bake that symbol into his loaves on feast days, not because it was required, but because it felt right. He used a twisted reed to make the mark, gently pressing it into the dough's soft top before sliding it into the oven. Some of the brothers began to ask for those loaves specifically. They claimed they tasted better. The cook said nothing, but he noticed the difference too. Herbs were more than ingredients in the abbey. They were part of its spiritual life. Monks believed that certain plants held divine order, that rosemary cleared the mind, that sage protected the soul, that thyme invited truth. The cook kept these beliefs alive in how he seasoned the simplest of meals. A pinch of this in the evening stew, a sprig of that in the broth before fasting. He kept bundles drying in the kitchen rafters, their scents mingling with smoke and bread and ale. He had learned to read their wilting patterns, the curl of leaves, the color of stems. When one batch refused to dry properly, he did not discard it. He took it to the garden, buried it by the cross, and whispered a thanks. Once, during a storm that shook the abbey walls and extinguished the chapel lamps, the cook found himself alone in the kitchen, the fire flickering low. The wind howled through the chimney, rattling pots and spilling herbs across the table. He lit a candle, gathered the spilled leaves into his hands, and carried them to the refectory. There, beneath the old carved crucifix, its arms rounded in the Celtic fashion, he laid them out on a cloth, reshaping the bundles, smoothing them with quiet reverence. As he did, the storm outside quieted, not entirely, but enough. Enough to finish his task without fear. It was not miracles that defined the cook's faith. It was memory, the memory of hands that taught him, of stones that stood long before him, of flavors that had no recipe, only rhythm. The abbey was not only a place of God, it was a place where belief had been layered over belief, like bread rising slowly in a warm oven. And he, the cook, was part of that layering, whether he meant to be or not. He did not need to know where the old symbols came from. He only needed to know that they still worked, in the garden, in the kitchen, in the hearts of tired men who found peace in hot broth and a clean floor. That was enough. That was sacred. The cook often found himself walking the same paths through the abbey grounds, his feet retracing steps taken countless times. But now he paid more attention to what had once gone unnoticed, the old stones at the edge of the herb garden, the twisted ivy along the cloister arches, the way certain spots seemed warmer in the sun despite the wind. These were not just quirks of place. They were signals, echoes of something older than his recipes or his prayers, something that pulsed through the land itself. He remembered Brother Mayle, long since passed, who had once told him that the land remembers, that even under new names and new rulers, the soil holds what it was taught. The cook hadn't believed him at the time, but in the quiet days that followed the dissolution, when the bells no longer rang and the halls echoed with stillness, he began to understand. There had once been a festival, now long forbidden, that the monks whispered about with both amusement and reverence. It was held at the turn of spring when the frost first released its grip. They called it Imbolc, though it was now celebrated in the name of Saint Brigid. The cook knew it had deeper roots sunk into the earth when gods were still imagined as flame or river or stag. During that time, they would light a small fire in the garden, just one, and place offerings of milk and bread beside it. Nothing grand, nothing spoken, just a gesture. The cook had watched this ceremony in secret as a boy, hidden behind a hedgerow, unsure if what he witnessed was holy or forbidden. Years later, after he had taken his vows and earned his place in the kitchen, he found himself repeating the gesture. A small piece of cheese, a crust of fresh baked loaf, placed beside the herb bed on the evening of February's first day. Not out of superstition, out of respect, and perhaps out of memory. He never told anyone. He didn't need to. The act was its own form of prayer. The kitchen itself bore signs of this quiet blending of belief. On the main beam above the hearth, carved deep into the wood, was a triskel, triple spiral common in old Celtic art. No one claimed to have carved it. It had always been there, older than the roof, older than the cook himself. He often stared at it while stirring broth, tracing its curves with his eyes. Some said it represented the Trinity. Others claimed it marked the seasons, the stages of life, the balance of elements. The cook didn't argue. He believed it simply meant continuity, one thing leading into another without end. There were other signs. A shallow bowl set into the base of the southern wall where water collected after rain. Always cold. Always still. The monks never drank from it, but they often dipped their fingers in and traced the sign of the cross on their foreheads. The cook did the same, though he never quite knew why. It felt right. The water never turned green. Never bred mosquitoes. It just stayed. Even the act of making bread held something sacred beyond scripture. On days of celebration, the cook would score the dough in careful patterns before baking, not just the cross, but knots and circles, spirals and suns. He'd learned them from the margins of the monastery's oldest manuscript, a crumbling copy of the Gospel of Matthew, with illuminated letters shaped like beasts and vines. The scribe had been an artist clearly, and perhaps a dreamer. Some of the images showed creatures not found in the Bible, stags crowned with stars, hounds leaping through fire, birds with human eyes. The abbot once dismissed them as decorative. The cook wasn't so sure. To him, they looked like memory symbols of the world that had come before. That manuscript had vanished during the second inspection. Taken or sold, no one knew, but the cook had memorized the patterns. And when he marked his loaves, he remembered the colors, the curls, the strange and beautiful beasts that danced through sacred text. There was an old well near the back of the property, half collapsed, its stones slick with moss. Few came near it anymore. But the cook knew its story. Once, long ago, a brother had fallen ill, and the water from that well was said to have cured him. Not instantly, but gently, over days, as he sipped it in the early light of morning. The monks called it St. Lactan's Well, but the cook suspected it had a name long before that one spoken in the tongue of shepherds and wanderers. On feast days, he would sometimes take a small jug of water from it to use in the bread. Just a little. Enough to carry the blessing. He never wrote any of this down. There were no recipes for belief, no measurements for reverence. But these rituals, these gestures, had become part of the food. Not in taste, perhaps, but in rhythm and intention. And that he believed was enough to nourish. Once, during a summer evening thick with the scent of thyme and lavender, a traveler arrived at the gate. Not a monk. Not a pilgrim. Just a man with dust on his boots and silence in his eyes. The abbey had already emptied by then, the bells taken down, the altar bare, but the cook invited him in. No words were exchanged. He simply ladled out a bowl of thin stew and broke off a piece of bread. The traveler ate slowly, nodded once, and left by sunrise. Later, when the cook returned to the place where the man had sat, he found a carved stone left on the bench. Just a small disc, marked with a spiral. He didn't know what it meant. Or maybe he did. He placed it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the light touched it every morning. It stayed there, long after the broth ran out, long after the herb bundles turned to dust. The cook didn't think of himself as a keeper of lore, but the old beliefs had seeped into him all the same. Not through study, through repetition, through soil, through fire. He had come to understand that the sacred was not always spoken in Latin or written in ink. Sometimes it was pressed into bread, whispered to plants, poured into pots. And in the quiet corners of the abbey where time moved slower, where the past hummed just beneath the surface, he knew something holy still lingered. It wasn't doctrine. It wasn't rule. It was presence. And it stayed. Chapter 12. An Abbot's Quiet Supper in the Refectory. The refectory had always been a place of silence. Not the hush of emptiness, but a silence filled with motion-bowed heads. Moving hands, the soft scrape of spoons against wooden bowls. It was a silence that spoke of discipline and rhythm, of obedience without resistance. Each monk had his place, his duties, and his portion. And at the head of the long table, under the carved arch of oak beams, sat the abbot. The cook had watched the abbot from his quiet station by the serving door for many years. He never served him directly, one of the junior brothers did that, but he prepared every meal the abbot ate. And in doing so, he came to understand something few others did. That leadership in the abbey was expressed not in grandeur, but in subtle restraint. The abbot's meal was never larger than the others. If anything, it was simpler. A bowl of barley stew, a small round of bread, a wedge of soft cheese when available. On feast days, he might receive a poached egg or a sliver of salted fish laid gently across lentils. But there were no luxuries, no excess. His position granted him solitude, not indulgence. Unlike the other brothers who dined in rows, the abbot sat alone at the head of the hall, a single candle flickering beside his plate. He did not speak. No one did. During meals, readings were delivered in a measured voice from the lectern passages from the Rule of St. Benedict, or from Scripture, or from the lives of saints long past. The abbot listened like all the rest, chewing slowly, folding each bite into prayer. But it was after the others had left that his true supper began. The cook had noticed it first one winter evening, many years ago, when the frost clung to the inside of the windows, and the bread had come out underproofed. The monks had eaten and dispersed. The cook remained to clean, and the abbot stayed seated. He did not ask for more food. He did not call out. He simply waited until the room was empty, then unfolded a small cloth bundle he had hidden beneath the table. Inside were 3 items: a plum, a pinch of salt, and a small twist of dried rosemary. Not much, nothing special. But to the cook watching from the shadows, it felt ceremonial. The abbot held the plum in both hands, pressed it gently to his lips, then peeled it with slow, deliberate fingers. He ate it in 4 bites, pausing between each, as if measuring time. Then he touched the salt to his tongue, and finally rubbed the rosemary between his palms before inhaling the scent. The cook said nothing of what he saw. He simply made sure, from then on, that the pantry always had a few plums dried in winter, fresh in summer, and that rosemary grew near the back wall where it caught the morning sun. Over time, he learned the pattern of the abbot's quiet suppers. On stormy nights, he took a cup of warm water steeped with mint. On feast days, he broke off the end crust of the loaf and held it in his hand for many minutes before eating. On the darkest days of Lent, he took nothing. Just sat there, still and upright, as if the act of restraint was a kind of nourishment. There was a story once told among the younger brothers about how the abbot had once been a soldier, a man who had seen battle and blood before finding the silence of the abbey. The cook never asked if it was true, but there was something about the abbot's movements, precise, composed, that suggested a man who had learned control the hard way. His hands bore scars, not large, not dramatic, just the fine lines of someone who had held sharp tools or rough weapons. In the kitchen, the cook prepared the abbot's portions with extra care, not out of fear or duty, but out of a quiet admiration. The simplicity of the abbot's meals taught him more than any sermon. They taught him how to value a single bite, how to respect hunger without indulging it, how to turn food into meditation. There was one dish the abbot favored above all others, though he never requested it. A humble combination of lentils, root vegetables, and wild herbs, slow cooked until it formed a soft, fragrant paste. The cook discovered it by accident one spring using leftover ingredients before the new season's crops arrived. He served it out of necessity, apologizing silently for its plainness. But the abbot had nodded, eaten every spoonful, and returned the bowl completely clean. After that, the cook began preparing it once a month, always without fanfare, always served with a single sprig of thyme laid across the surface. He called it the quiet bowl. In time, so did the others. The cook often wondered what the abbot thought about while eating alone. Did he pray? Did he reflect on the abbey's future? Did he remember his life before the robes? Or was he simply listening to the wind through the eaves, to the settling stone, to the breath of a space that had held centuries? On one occasion, near the feast of St. Columba, the abbot remained seated long after his supper. The cook, sweeping nearby, paused when he heard something unusual. A low murmur. Not words exactly, more a hum steady and soft. A melody, perhaps, or a chant without language. The abbot's eyes were closed. His fingers rested lightly on the rim of his bowl. The sound continued for a full minute before fading. The cook finished his sweeping in silence. He never intruded on the abbot's private rituals, but he supported them in the way he knew best through small acts of preparation. He kept the lentils rinsed and ready. He dried rosemary carefully, ensuring it remained fragrant. He saved the freshest fruit for the quiet bowl, even if it meant giving the rest of the monks the bruised apples. And when the time came after the letters, after the inspections, after the bells were removed and the chapel doors sealed, it was the abbot's table that the cook cleaned last. He scrubbed the wood gently, following the grain with his cloth. He placed a single candle at the far end, unlit, and he left a folded cloth where the abbot used to rest his hands. He did not weep, but his hands lingered on the table longer than necessary, pressing into the wood, trying to remember its warmth. The abbot had never said goodbye. One morning, he was simply gone. His robes folded on the cot, his sandals placed neatly by the door. No note, no instruction, just absence. And in that absence, the cook prepared one final quiet bowl. He placed it on the abbot's table, waited until the candle burned low, then carried the bowl out to the garden and buried it beneath the rosemary bush. Some silences are not empty. They are full of what was. Though their names rarely made it into the official records, women in Saxon mining towns carried their own legacies, quiet ones, spoken aloud in kitchens and whispered over firelight. They were measured not by titles or achievements, but by endurance. Everyone remembered the widow who worked through a fever, the mother who lost 4 sons but still came to the wash yard, the girl who lifted twice her weight in stone with a rope lashed around her shoulders. One such woman was Greet, known by all in her town not for her beauty, which had long faded under sun and soot, but for her strength. Greet was neither kind nor cruel. She was efficient. A widow twice over, she had once been married to a miner and then, briefly, to a cart driver who drowned during a storm. Left with 3 boys, she refused to beg. Instead, she took work as a cloughbaron, then as a washerin, and finally as a carrier, dragging barrels of water up the incline paths when others wouldn't. Children feared her. Women respected her. Men stayed out of her way. And every winter she survived. Greet was not the only woman to carry that kind of reputation. In towns where mines drove every part of life, there was always a handful of women who became legends, not queens or saints. But the kind of figures whose lives you measured your own against, they rarely smiled, because smiles took effort. They didn't weep where anyone could see. But they knew how to wrap a cracked hand, how to barter for a better price on rye, how to hide a bruised face until it healed. And they watched. Everything. In a community built on risk, where a single spark or slip could ruin a family, women became the quiet sentinels of daily survival. They kept track of who owed what, who had gone hungry, who hadn't left the tavern in days. This knowledge passed silently. A loaf here, a glance there. A warning whispered over a washtub. Don't trust him. He didn't bury the last one, right? Their power was soft, indirect, but real. It helped prevent conflict. It calmed frightened children. It stitched the edges of a frayed town together. Marriage was rarely romantic. Most women were married young, often just after their first bleeding. The men they married were minors by default. There were few choices. A woman might be wed to a man she barely knew and widowed within a year. The second marriage came faster, colder, more about stability than love. Affection, when it happened, came later, in small gestures, a shared crust, a hand on the shoulder, a blanket laid gently over his sleeping feet. But love, in the romantic sense, was a luxury, and luxuries were for other towns. Those who didn't marry often had harder lives. A woman alone, without a husband or father to link her name to, faced more scrutiny. If she laughed too loudly, she was suspect. If she walked alone, she was watched. And yet, some women chose that path, quiet independence, tough as leather. They carved out their places with calloused hands and sharp stares. They worked harder, spoke less, and kept secrets. One such woman, Anna, lived in a stone shed near the edge of town. No one quite remembered how she came to be there. Some said she had once been a baron's maid who'd fallen from grace. Others whispered she'd fled another village, carrying only a basket and a bundle of letters. But she worked without complaint, washing ore, hauling firewood, binding wounds. She never asked for anything, and over time, people began to leave food by her door. Not out of pity, but respect. Anna never attended church. She never entered the tavern. But when the floods came in spring and the lower houses filled with water, it was Anna who carried a child out of the muck, wrapped in her own coat. After that, no one spoke ill of her again. Women formed their own bonds. In the washyards over boiling kettles, while hanging laundry on icy lines, they shared stories, sorrows, and strategies. They knew which herbs softened skin, which stitches held a wound shut, which words calmed a dying man. These skills were never formally taught, just absorbed, like heat from a fire you didn't notice until it was gone. And they passed them down. Daughters learned by doing, by watching. A girl of 10 could dress a minor burn, gut a trout, or balance a full bucket on her head. By 12, she could tell the difference between copper dust and worthless shale. By 14, she had her own blister scars. Childhood didn't end in a moment. It faded, rubbed away day by day, like the color on a favorite apron. Faith offered little comfort. The church spoke of virtue, of obedience, of eternal reward, but it rarely mentioned the strain in a mother's back or the endless hunger of a growing boy. The priests wore clean robes. They spoke Latin. They lived in houses with dry roofs and whole glass windows. And though they heard confessions and gave blessings, few ever came near the washyards. Still, women kept their own kind of faith, not in salvation, perhaps, but in patterns, the rhythm of seasons. The stubborn return of sunrise, the way dough rises if left undisturbed. These quiet truths were more reliable than sermons. Death was constant, but not always tragic. A stillbirth, a sudden fever, a shaft collapse, these were facts of life. Mourning was short, practical. Grief took the form of action. A pot of soup delivered, a floor scrubbed in silence. A child's hair braided carefully, even after the mother was gone. Over time, cemeteries filled with their names. Most were simple, just wooden crosses, carved by hand, weathered smooth by wind and time. Some had no names at all, just initials or a small stone marker. But if you asked anyone in town who had held the mine together, not the shaft, but the town, they would nod toward those graves. Because it was the women who cooked, who patched, who endured. While the men dug downward, the women held the ground above. They weren't martyrs. They weren't saints. They were just there, every day, every season. And the mine remembered. Chapter 30. Cursed Pies and Forbidden Recipes. The Abbey kitchen, by daylight, was a place of motion and rhythm, smoke curling upward, ladles clinking against pots, footsteps echoing on flagstones. But once in a while, just past midnight, the room seemed to change. The hearth still glowed softly from the evening's fire, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The scent of baked barley and thyme still lingered, yet the silence held something heavier, something older. The cook did not often stay that late, but when he did, he sometimes felt as though he were not alone. Not in a fearful way, exactly more like the kitchen itself remembered too much to ever truly sleep. It was on one such night, many years ago, that Brother Dathy first told the cook about the cursed pie. They had finished scrubbing the pans from a saint's feast and were drying their hands by the fire when Dathy, who rarely spoke without reason, leaned in close and said, very calmly, there was once a recipe that made a man forget who he was. The cook had raised an eyebrow. Dathy nodded, serious as ever. They called it the pie of forgetting. Oats, onion, wild garlic, and something else. Something not written. Only passed by mouth. The brother who baked it, he'd lost his name before the week was out. Couldn't even recall his vows. They say the pie worked too well. The story was absurd, of course. But Dathy wasn't one to spin tailies. And there had always been strange things in old cookbooks. Pages sewn shut. Ingredients crossed out not with ink, but with ash. One manuscript in the back of the scriptorium bore a warning. Let no man combine the root and the fruit. No explanation followed. The cook had come to understand that within monastic kitchens, not everything passed through the hands of reason. Some recipes were preserved not for nourishment, but for remembrance, or avoidance. And some meals were said to call things, not spirits, exactly, but memories, feelings, silences that shouldn't linger. There was a tale among the novices about a sweet cake served only once a year. On the eve of St. Bridget's Day, it was made with a mixture of ground almonds, dried plums, and a syrup that no one could identify. The recipe was kept locked in a small wooden box that had no key, only a wax seal pressed with a cross and spiral. Legend said that whoever ate it would dream of someone they had wronged. A former brother claimed the cake had made him cry uncontrollably, though he wouldn't say why. The cook had never seen the cake, but he had found the box once, hidden behind a loose stone in the wall behind the flour sacks. He hadn't opened it. He didn't dare. But he had held it, and it had felt heavier than wood and paper ought to, as though the weight inside wasn't just ingredients, but something older. Over time, he collected these stories like herbs tucked into memory, steeped in quiet wonder. He began noticing the signs others ignored. A rust-colored stain on an old recipe scroll, shaped like a handprint. A pot that boiled over only when lentils and dill were combined. A pastry recipe that required silence during mixing, or it would refuse to rise. He did not fear these things. He simply worked around them. He learned, too, that some ingredients held reputations. Not for flavor, but for their effects. Monkshood, of course, was forbidden. But others' lovage, water hemlock, even wild fennel, were whispered about as having properties beyond the stomach. Certain brothers refused to eat dishes with sage, claiming it brought too vivid dreams. One swore that when he consumed a stew heavy with marjoram, he heard music long after the meal was done. The cook did not dismiss these tales, nor did he embrace them. He catalogued them quietly, the way one observes stars on a clear night, not close enough to touch, but impossible to ignore. One particular recipe, handed to him on brittle parchment by an elderly monk with clouded eyes, stayed with him for years. It was titled simply Bread for Crossing. No notes, no measurements, just a list of 6 ingredients, one of which was described only as the breath of elder flame. No one knew what that meant. The old monk had claimed it was a metaphor, or a mistranslation. But the cook never forgot the name. He wondered sometimes if these so-called cursed or enchanted recipes had ever truly worked, or if their magic lay in belief itself. A meal prepared with trembling hands might taste strange only because fear flavored it. A broth served in grief might seem bitter because the tongue remembered sorrow. Still, there were patterns too consistent to ignore, recipes only attempted on certain moons, meals abandoned after one disastrous attempt, pages missing from scrolls that were otherwise meticulously kept. One chilling winter, the cook accidentally uncovered a sealed pot buried behind the root cellar. It was marked only with a wax seal, no label. He asked no one about it. He reburied it. Some vessels were not meant to be reopened. Even his own recipe book, handwritten over decades, bore signs of avoidance. Margins filled with warnings. Omit during Lent. Never serve alone. Ask Brother G if unsure. At one point, There were 3 pages missing in a stretch of barley variations. Torn cleanly, he couldn't remember when it had happened, or why, but he remembered the pie. Not the cursed one, but another, a meatless tart made with leeks, soft cheese, and a strange spice that turned the tongue warm for hours. He had learned it from a wandering pilgrim who spoke no Latin, but drew perfect diagrams of root vegetables. The pilgrim had said little, but when he handed the recipe to the cook, he placed a hand on his chest and smiled, as if carefully. The cook had baked it once. The monks had eaten it in silence. That night, 3 of them confessed old sins unprompted. 1 wept openly in the chapel. The abbot had said nothing. But afterward, the cook filed the recipe away, not out of fear, but out of respect. He often thought about what made a recipe sacred or dangerous. Was it the ingredients? The intentions? The hands that shaped it? Or was it the space it was made in, the old stone walls, the memory of prayers, the echoes of bells? In the end, he kept cooking. He followed the patterns he trusted and avoided the ones that resisted. He never called anything cursed. He simply chose not to serve certain things. And when he stood in the kitchen alone, long after midnight, he sometimes felt that the room itself approved. The cook's life, like the abbey's rhythm, was built on habit and repetition, but there remained certain dishes he would not prepare after sundown, not because of doctrine or instruction, but because of stories, because of something passed between brothers, handed down like a relic, without parchment or ink. The recipe might have looked innocent, just rye flour, honey, and wild mint, but something in the back of his mind told him, no, not tonight, not while the wind moaned in the trees. Some of the monks dismissed these superstitions outright, calling them relics of a more pagan Ireland. But they still never touched the bowl marked with the twisted knot carved into its rim. That bowl had been in the abbey for over 100 years. Its glaze had long since faded, its shape imperfect, and yet no one dared discard it. Everyone simply avoided it, as if the pottery itself held a memory too heavy to forget. It was during an unusually foggy spring that a strange visitor arrived, a traveling healer from Connaught, wrapped in layers of linen and bearing bundles of dried roots and scrolls. He had come on foot, claiming to seek shelter and rest, but his true motive became clear as he lingered near the kitchen. He asked the cook curious questions. Had he ever tried steeping bay leaf with juniper bark? Did he know that nettle, when dried under the full moon, softened bitterness in old grain? The man's knowledge was extensive, but it leaned toward the mystical, the whispered, the half-remembered. He carried with him a tiny leather-bound book, its pages fragile and packed with diagrams, scribbles, and notes in a hand, unlike any script in the abbey's library. The cook caught a glimpse of it one evening by firelight. One page bore an illustration of a human tongue surrounded by curling vines. Another showed a pastry, triangular and marked with a circle inside a square, labeled with a name the cook had never heard and could not pronounce. The healer offered to exchange a recipe one, known to lift the veil of sleep and grant a man prophetic dreams for a simple favor, access to the abbey's oldest kitchen ledger. The cook refused, not because he feared the man, but because he knew that once certain recipes were unbound, they could not be forgotten. Some knowledge was best left untraded. Still, the visit stirred something in him. After the healer departed, leaving only a faint smell of camphor and dried yarrow, the cook climbed the narrow stairs to the scriptorium and retrieved an old bundle of kitchen records kept in a carved cedar chest. These scrolls were older than he was, penned in Latin mixed with Old Gaelic, annotated with strange marks that no one had translated. Some entries were clear, counts of grain, notes on spoilage, the cost of salt during the last famine, but others hinted at a different language altogether, a way of speaking about food that dealt not just with hunger, but with memory, fear, and devotion. One scroll listed 7 meals to be made under specific conditions. The 3rd watch was reserved for nights when lightning struck the eastern tower. The 5th required total silence from start to finish. The last watch, unnamed, bore only the phrase, "Do not prepare when the wren sings at dusk." The cook didn't know what it meant, but he copied the list into his own book and underlined it in red. These oddities weren't confined to food alone. The abbey's calendar of feasts occasionally included notations besides certain saints' days. A small fish symbol, a forked line, a drawn eye. These marks weren't explained, but they always seemed to correspond to subtle changes in the kitchen. One day, the yeast would refuse to rise. Another, the broth would separate no matter how long it simmered. On such days, the cook followed instinct rather than formula. Sometimes he didn't cook at all. Brother Malachi, the herb keeper, once told the cook that every monastery had at least one recipe that shouldn't be spoken aloud, not written, not whispered, just remembered and left unmade. He said that words have weight and that some combinations open more than the palate. The cook didn't laugh. He simply nodded. There was one more tale he had never repeated, not even to the abbot. Years ago, before he had earned his robe, he had found a recipe scratched into the inside of a cupboard door. It was barely legible, half erased by time and smoke. But he recognized the shape of it. Ingredients listed not by name but by memory. A handful of grief, the silence of a winter morning, the breath of a sleeping child. It was poetry, perhaps, or madness. But something about it chilled him. He never attempted the recipe, but he memorized it. And to this day, he sometimes felt that the cupboard itself hummed faintly when opened during the twilight hour. Not every strange recipe was cursed. Some were simply misunderstood. There were dishes meant to calm trembling hands, others crafted to prepare a soul for vigil. Meals with no flavor, designed to reset the senses. The cook believed these recipes had value, but he also believed that misused careless hands, wrong timing, arrogance could turn healing into harm. So he treated every recipe with reverence, every measure exact, every herb intentional. He taught the younger brothers to cook with patience, not haste. And though he never spoke of the forbidden recipes, he taught them how to recognize when food didn't want to be made, when dough felt stubborn, when broth turned cloudy, when fire flickered blue, signs that something was off, something ancient. Toward the end of his life, the cook began writing a second book, not of instructions but of observations. A dish that refuses salt, bread that rises in silence. The Night of the Three Cracks, each entry short, factual, emotionless. He never claimed to know why. He only recorded what he saw. He left the book unfinished, hidden in the folds of an old apron, stitched behind the hem. Long after he was gone, a young novice cleaning out the kitchen would find it. He would not understand half of what it said, but he would keep it. And some nights, as wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, he would open it, trace the faded ink, and wonder what kind of world lived behind the recipes. Not just one of hunger, but of meaning, of mystery, of reverence. Chapter 14. Midnight in a Monastic Garden. By day, the monastic garden was a place of purpose. Neatly divided beds held parsley, leeks, and thyme. Low walls of stone lined the paths, and bees from the hives near the orchard moved lazily from flower to flower, gathering the abbey's sweetness. Every plant had a role. Some healed, some flavored. A few repelled pests. Even the humble nettle, cursed by many, had its uses. But at night the garden changed. It did not sleep exactly. It watched. The cook had learned over many seasons that plants behave differently under moonlight. The sage curled ever so slightly toward the east. The rosemary lifted its head. And certain flowers, those never harvested, never named, opened only once the sun had gone. It was in this quiet half-light, with dew rising off the soil and shadows pooling like water, that he found his calm. He had not always walked the garden at midnight. In his younger years, there had been too much to do, fires to stoke, bread to proof, broth to check. But as his routine settled and the abbey quieted with time, he began to slip outside when the bells finished their final toll. He carried no lantern. He knew the path by heart. His first stop was always the mint bed. Not to pick, but to inhale. The scent cleared his thoughts. Fresh, sharp, grounding. Then the wild carrot, which had seated itself along the edges. Then the lavender bush, old and woody now, but still blooming in patches. He didn't always gather herbs at night. That was reserved for particular moments. Days when the kitchen felt heavy with unspoken tension, or when the broth refused to hold flavor. Sometimes he harvested during the full moon valerian root, especially. Other times it was more instinct than schedule. He would run his fingers across the leaves, and if they bent toward him, if they seemed ready, he would take what he needed. There was an understanding between him and the plants. He never took too much. He never pulled by force. And he always whispered a small thank you, not out of superstition. Out of respect. The garden had once been managed by Brother Cormac, a soft-spoken man with hands like bark and a memory for every seed. Long before illness took him, he had taught the cook the rhythms of the soil, the way to layer mulch from the compost pit, the best days to sow cabbage, the signs that a plant was unhappy. But more than technique, he had taught a kind of listening. Some things don't like to grow beside each other, Cormac had once said, pointing to fennel and basil. And some things thrive when their neighbors are kind. That lesson stayed with the cook in more ways than one. In the northern corner of the garden stood the elder tree, gnarled, half hollow, and older than the abbey walls. It never bore fruit. Its blossoms were sparse, yet no one touched it. It was considered sacred, or at least untouchable. A legend passed down said that those who caught from the elder without permission would lose their voice. The cook did not believe in curses, but he believed in boundaries. He never went near it. Instead, he focused on the beds he knew. The chamomile that settled unease, the sorrel that brightened stew, the bay laurel that burned with a clean, sharp smoke. He treated each like a member of the abbey watched over, tended, spoken to gently. The garden was where he processed the things he could not name aloud. The days when a brother fell ill and never rose again. The long periods of silence after the abbot disappeared. The strange noises from the woods during the famine years. All of it sank into the soil beneath his boots, where the herbs grew tall and fragrant. He once found a bird, still warm, curled in the rosemary. No wounds, just still. He buried it gently, marked the spot with a stone, and never picked from that bush again. Some signs didn't need explanation. There were nights when he would sit at the edge of time bed, back against the wall, eyes tilted toward the stars. He could name the constellations, but he rarely did. It wasn't about knowledge, it was about stillness. The stars said nothing, and in their silence he found company. One particularly cold night, frost curling over the garden paths, he noticed a strange pattern in the snow. Circles around the dill, untouched footprints near the bee boxes, and a single line drawn through the ash bed with the edge of a stick. At first, he thought it was the wind. But the shape was too exact. He didn't tell the other monks. He simply walked the path again the next night. Nothing. But the sense of being observed lingered, not with malice, just presence. He began leaving a bit of warm broth outside the garden door each night, a small bowl, never spoken of. In the morning, it was always empty. Whether it fed a cat, a fox, or something else, he never asked. Offering was not always about understanding. Sometimes it was just about peace. Among the herbs, he felt himself aging slowly. His joints stiffened with each passing winter. His eyes dimmed. But the garden did not judge. It welcomed his hands, whether firm or trembling. It gave without demand. When he trained younger cooks, he did not always take them into the garden, only those who moved with care, who stepped lightly, who didn't crush mint underfoot or tug basil too fast. He showed them how to talk to the plants, even if only in thought. He told them to let the rosemary rest on the tongue before chopping, to crush sage with the back of a spoon, not a blade, and to never, ever take from the nightshade, which grew wild at the fence and bore berries too bright to be innocent. The cook knew his time was growing shorter. He felt it in the way the cold lingered in his bones. He did not fear death. He only hoped the garden would be tended after him, that someone would remember which plants thrived beside others, which ones needed shade, which ones listened best at midnight. And so each night he continued his rounds, mint, carrot, lavender, sage, and finally the rosemary, a circle of gratitude. A ritual not spoken of, but deeply known. The seasons changed slowly in the monastic garden, though the cook felt each one with an intimacy few others noticed. Spring came with the sweet, almost electric scent of thawing soil and the emergence of chive buds. Summer carried the low drone of bees, the yellowing of mint leaves, the dry crumbling of sage under sunlight. Autumn was perhaps the most generous, with the rosemary turning fragrant and full, the thyme creeping further along the stone edges, and the basil blooming one last time before retreating into seed. And then winter, the stillest of all. A season when the garden slept, but never fully withdrew. Beneath the frost, roots dreamed. The cook came to understand that gardening was never about control. It was about trust. You planted, you watched, you waited. Sometimes things grew. Sometimes they did not. And often what grew was not what you had planned. It was in the winter of his 58th year that the cook began preparing a record, not for himself, but for whoever might take his place. It wasn't a manual. He had no interest in rules. Instead, it was a collection of thoughts laid out like stepping stones. He wrote, "Do not speak while tending basil." It listens. He wrote, "Cut lavender only after dew has dried. It bruises otherwise." He wrote, "The bees forgive once, the nettles do not." His notes filled 3 small books, none labeled, all tucked into the shelf behind the barley jars. They were stories as much as instructions, memories in disguise. He included sketches of the elder tree, even though he had never dared touch it, and listed the times it had flowered, the months it had shed its leaves early, the strange smell it sometimes gave off during storms. He wrote of Brother Cormac, and the way he hummed softly to the time as he worked. Of the night he saw the moon reflected in the rain barrel and felt, for a moment, as though the garden were an extension of the sky. Of the time he buried a broken rosary beneath the sorrel bush, where it stayed buried and forgotten by all but the mint. The cook did not call these things lessons. He called them remembrances, and in a quiet way he hoped that someday another pair of hands would read them, not with analysis, but with feeling. That they would step out into the cool air, kneel by the rosemary, and simply listen. Toward the final spring of his life, the cook no longer walked the garden paths in full. His knees ached too much, and the nights bit more sharply than before. Instead, he sat just at the threshold, wrapped in his heavy cloak, hands curled around a warm cup, and watched. The garden did not mind. It had known him for decades. It did not need his touch to recognize him. One evening, a young monk joined him. Barely out of novitiate, curious but cautious, he did not speak at first. Simply sat beside the cook, mirroring his stillness. The two of them watched the lavender sway in the breeze. The moon lit the thyme in silver. Somewhere an owl stirred. After a long silence, the young monk whispered, "Do you ever feel like the garden hears us?" The cook didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He just nodded once and said, "Every night." From then on, the boy joined him most evenings. Sometimes they talked softly about flavors or roots or how to dry nettles without wilting the leaves. Sometimes they said nothing at all. But gradually, the cook began passing things on. Not just words, but gestures. The way to pat the soil just once after planting. The way to hold sage between 2 fingers and test its dryness by sound. One night, during the feast of St. Ida, the cook handed the boy a bundle of tied rosemary and said, "This will be your first supper for the brethren. Steep it in broth. Just enough. Don't boil it. Let it speak." The boy obeyed. The meal was quiet, simple, comforting. No one remarked on the change. But the cook saw the way a few brothers lingered over their bowls, breathing in the steam, eyes softened. He said nothing, but he felt it. The rhythm had begun to shift. As the days lengthened and the sun returned to the garden walls, the cook prepared fewer meals. He stepped back from the stove. He rose later. He watched more often than he worked. And yet they had been held together. The food arrived on time. The herbs were dried in bundles. The garden flourished. One morning, before matins, the cook took a final walk slow, deliberate, leaning on a staff Brother Aelb had carved for him. He paused by the mint, as always, then the wild carrot, then the lavender. He touched each gently, murmuring a quiet thanks. When he reached the elder tree, he did not go closer, but he bowed just once. He left a single sprig of rosemary in the kitchen, tied with twine, set beside his knife, and beneath it, a note written in his careful hand. Listen well. Stir slowly. Let silence season the broth. That evening, the young monk prepared supper alone for the first time. The refectory was full. The meal was simple barley, onion, broth thickened with parsnip, and a quiet trace of rosemary. No one spoke during the meal. No one needed to. And outside, under the moon's soft light, the garden listened. The abbey would endure many more winters. Its walls would be patched, its bells retuned, its records rewritten. But the garden would keep growing, slowly, steadily, as it always had. And in the rustle of the sage, the hush of the mint, the curl of frost on lavender, there would remain a memory not of grandeur nor miracles, but of care. A cook, a bowl, a sprig of rosemary, and the soft, constant breath of earth. And now, as the last coals cool in the abbey hearth and the garden rests once more beneath a canopy of stars, we bring this quiet journey to its close. You've walked the smoke-filled kitchens of medieval Ireland. You've stirred the barley for 80 hungry mouths, tended broth in silence, and felt the ache of fasting in a body already worn thin. You've stood beside ancient brewing casks, whispered thanks to rosemary under the moonlight, and passed the garden's invisible test of patience and reverence. In this world, time didn't move quickly. It crept like ivy over stone. The hours were marked by bells, but also by bread rising, spoons scraping pots, and the rustle of herbs in midnight air. You've heard the echoes of brothers long gone, their quiet footsteps on worn flagstones, the soft shuffling of robes, the occasional burst of laughter in a place built on silence. Life as a monastic cook in 14th century Ireland was not one of glory or celebration. There were no feasts of plenty, no ornate banquets lit by chandeliers. The table was long and wooden, its benches cold, its bowls simple. The meals were born of what could be grown, preserved, or traded: turnips, barley, bitter greens, wild leeks, and fish. Always fish. Even on holy days, indulgence was measured. 1 extra onion, a sliver of soft cheese, a bit more broth in the ladle. That was celebration. And yet, it mattered. Every bowl of soup prepared with care became a kind of prayer. Every herb crushed between fingers, every loaf placed on the hearth was a small offering, not just to God, but to the weary body. The silent brother, the rhythm of the monastery itself. The cook was never center stage, but he was always there before the bells and after the lights went dim. What endured across generations and upheavals was not just the recipes, but the way they were remembered. The unwritten rules passed between hands, the silent nods of approval. The belief that food could do more than nourish, it could steady a soul, bind a community, and carry memory. As you lie there now, letting your breath fall into its own rhythm, consider how different this life was from yours. And yet, in some ways, how familiar: the clatter of dishes, the warmth of broth on a cold morning, the way a garden hums after dusk, the desire to feed, to heal, to serve quietly and well. These are not bound by century or creed. Perhaps you too have your own kitchen rituals. The stirring of a pot when words fail, the choosing of herbs when the mind feels tangled, the simple comfort of sharing a meal in silence. In those moments, you share something with the cook, with the abbey, with the long line of hands that have made food not just a necessity, but a form of devotion. Tonight, the monastery is still. The stone corridors are dark. A single candle flickers in the chapel window. Somewhere, a novice turns the last page of a worn book. A bee stirs in its hive, and the rosemary, tucked against the southern wall, dreams beneath the moon. Let your own mind now wander there, gently and without effort. Let the weight of the world fall away like flour through a sieve. Let your thoughts soften, like bread dough resting in a warm bowl. There's nothing left to stir, no meal left to prepare, no voice left to answer, only stillness, only sleep. Good night, and may your dreams be as gentle as the hush of mint in a midnight garden. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.